Welcome back to the quiet of the night. Settle in, let your eyes close, and allow your body to soften into the comfort of your bed. Tonight, we journey to a place defined by its routine, the rugged coastline of the Pacific Northwest, where the air is cool and the fog often lingers like a heavy, soft blanket. We are exploring a mystery best listened to in the dark, a case where the water held its secrets too close. Tonight, we begin the investigation into the enduring puzzle of the lighthouse keeper's vault. The year is 1998. Our setting is Port Haven, Oregon, a town clinging to the edge of the continent. And our central figure is a man named Arthur Jennings. Arthur was 56. He wasn't a man of great wealth or notoriety. He was a man of routine and commitment. For nearly 20 years, Arthur had served as the sole, full-time keeper of the Port Haven Lighthouse. His life was a study in predictable peace. Each day began with the pre-dawn climb up the winding spiral stairs to check the massive lens. This was followed by the meticulous logging of the weather, the barometric pressure, and the exact moment the light was required. The entire rhythm of his life was set by the tides and the duty of the light. His communication with the outside world was limited to a single crackly VHF radio and a single weekly trip into town for supplies. In Port Haven, he was known for two things: his quiet courtesy and his unwavering insistence on paying for everything, groceries, fuel, batteries, in crisp, old-fashioned money orders. He distrusted banks and paper trails. The lighthouse itself was his world, a tall, white sentinel against the gray sea, with thick granite walls that promised security. Inside the solid structure, Arthur had a small, Spartan apartment and a surprisingly comprehensive library. He was a man who appreciated things that lasted: well-bound books, finely crafted woodworking, and, most notably, a small, intricate collection of antique, high-denomination gold coins. This collection was his quiet passion, his secret comfort. The coins, dating back to the early 1900s, were valued at well over $250,000. This treasure was stored in a heavy, bolted safe built directly into the lighthouse's foundation in the basement, a safe he referred to with a slight smile as his vault. Arthur's existence was defined by its security, its isolation, and its perfect, unchanging schedule. It was a life built to withstand any storm. Arthur was due for his weekly visit to the mainland on a Friday morning. He always took the 9 a.m. ferry, the old Seagull, returning promptly on the 3 p.m. ferry. He never varied the schedule. The ferry captain, old Mr. Hemlock, could set his watch by Arthur. But on this particular Friday, the bell rang, the gangplank went up, and the Seagull departed without Arthur Jennings. By Saturday morning, concern had begun to creep in. A lighthouse keeper missing his duty was almost unthinkable. Mr. Hemlock radioed the Coast Guard, who dispatched a small cutter to Port Haven. The initial findings were immediately peculiar. The lighthouse was entirely secured. The heavy, iron exterior door was locked from the inside. The light itself was operational, rotating its steady beam across the empty ocean exactly as it should have. It was a scene of perfect, meticulous order, completely devoid of the usual signs of distress or struggle. Inside the structure, the Coast Guard found Arthur's small apartment tidy. His bed was made. His routine logbook was open to the previous day's entry, detailing the evening's fog levels. On the kitchen counter, they found his lunch, packed and still wrapped in wax paper, sitting beside the keys to the lighthouse door. The keys were inside the locked building. It was an immediate, impossible paradox. The Coast Guard searched the perimeter, the rocks, the water, nothing. No note, no forced entry. It was as if Arthur Jennings, a man of such solid physical presence, had simply dissolved. The local sheriff, Thomas Reed, took the lead. Reed was a seasoned veteran, but used to the slow, straightforward crimes of a small town. A phantom disappearance from a locked lighthouse was beyond his scope. He ordered a meticulous search of the structure, focusing on one area, the small basement vault where Arthur kept his coins. The vault was a massive old safe, hidden beneath a heavy trapdoor in the floor of Arthur's office. It took several hours for a locksmith flown in from the city to open it. The safe was open, and it was empty. The contents, the antique gold coins, valued at well over $250,000, were gone. This discovery changed everything. This was no longer just a missing person. This was now a crime of larceny and probable foul play. But the central puzzle remained: the locked lighthouse. How did someone remove the contents of a heavy, bolted safe and then vanish into thin air, leaving the keys inside a building locked from the inside? Sheriff Reed established 3 immediate, seemingly contradictory facts. First, Arthur Jennings was gone. Second, his valuable collection was gone. And third, there was absolutely no evidence of forced entry, either on the safe or on the building itself. The initial unsettling theory was that Arthur had taken the money and left. But if he had, why stage the scene with such misleading detail? Why the untouched lunch and the keys inside the locked sanctuary? The simplest solution was complicated by the iron security of the lighthouse itself. The fog outside only seemed to be growing heavier, obscuring the truth. But this fog, this puzzle, is precisely where we must look for the solution. We left the Port Haven lighthouse with an impossible contradiction: a locked building, an open vault, and a missing man. Sheriff Reed and his small team knew the answer wasn't in the churning water. It had to be in the sanctuary itself. The investigation became a study of the undisturbed. Forensic teams, working carefully around the historical site, found no signs of struggle, no rogue fibers, and no foreign footprints. The pervasive dust of the old stone tower was entirely undisturbed, except for the clearly defined path of Arthur Jennings' own worn leather boots. The thick granite walls of the lighthouse, designed to protect the beam from the wind, also served as a perfect acoustic shield. If a struggle had occurred, no sound would have traveled beyond the immediate room. The silence itself was a clue. Reed's first methodical step was to reconstruct Arthur's life through the few people who knew him. He interviewed the ferry captain, the supply clerk, and the handful of other local individuals who had interacted with Arthur over the decades. Every account was identical. Arthur was utterly predictable. His routines were his fortress. He was antisocial, intensely private, and fiercely independent. This consistency led the sheriff to a critical deduction. Any break in this pattern had to be deliberate and highly organized. The detective work turned inward, focusing on Arthur's financial profile. The lighthouse keeper lived on a modest salary, yet he possessed a rare collection valued at $250,000. Where did the money for the collection come from? It wasn't inherited. Arthur had no known relatives. It was built up meticulously, piece by piece, over 20 years. The true focus landed inevitably on the vault itself. The old safe, now empty, was massive, heavy, and bolted into the granite foundation. The locksmith who opened it confirmed that the main locking mechanism was undamaged. No explosives, no drilling. This ruled out common thieves. But the sheriff's forensic team found a detail the locksmith initially dismissed: a tiny, barely perceptible scoring around the safe's heavy steel hinge. It was not a violent scratch from prying. It was a fine, continuous abrasion, suggesting subtle, patient work over a significant period of time. This was not a moment of forceful entry. It was a process of calculated, methodical manipulation. The person who emptied the vault had not broken the lock. They had undermined its foundation with slow, careful precision. This pointed definitively to someone who knew the safe's structural weaknesses, someone who had access to it over months or years. The inside job theory began to solidify. The perpetrator had to be Arthur. Only he had the unique combination of motive, intimate access, and the absolute solitude required to conduct such slow, long-term tampering. The crime wasn't a spontaneous grab. It was a meticulously prepared act of deception. This was reinforced by the discovery of an impending financial deadline. A quiet check with the insurance firm revealed that Arthur had recently renewed his policy on the gold coin collection, raising its valuation significantly. Crucially, that updated policy, which covered theft, was due to expire in less than 2 weeks. The theft and subsequent disappearance had been timed with cold, calculated efficiency, tied to an approaching financial cutoff point. The motive was not just simple theft, but an insurance fraud designed to maximize his windfall before his security net vanished. Now they understood the why and the how of the safe. But the central enigma of the locked lighthouse remained. If Arthur had committed the perfect inside job, how did he then escape his self-imposed prison, leaving the keys inside? The answer had to be hidden somewhere in the lighthouse's unique, aging architecture. The team was ordered to look beyond the surface, to examine the building not as a home, but as a sealed mechanical system designed by the sea itself. With the inside job theory firmly established, Sheriff Reed focused the investigation on the single remaining impossibility: the locked lighthouse. The crime was now understood as a careful, patient act of self-theft, but the escape route remained elusive. The answer was not a violent breakthrough. It had to be a technical workaround, a secret exit only the keeper himself would know. The search team shifted its focus from the living quarters to the rarely seen mechanical areas. They explored the vast, cold granite shell of the foundation, the storage rooms for oil and fuel, and the deep, dark corners dedicated to the tower's function. This methodical search of the deep structure finally yielded a key piece of evidence, not directly related to the gold, but to Arthur's deep preparation. Beneath the floorboards of Arthur's extensive library, a space filled with books on maritime history and engineering, they discovered a hidden compartment. Inside this compartment was not cash or coins, but a small roll of yellowed, brittle maritime blueprints of the lighthouse, dating back to its original construction in the 1920s. These documents were highly technical. They weren't focused on the tower or the light itself, but on the hidden infrastructure that serviced the building: the freshwater catchment systems, the waste disposal, and most notably, the complex seawater intake and drainage pipe system. This system was designed to draw cold ocean water into the lower levels for various utility functions before emptying it back out to sea. One blueprint highlighted a heavy, decommissioned iron pipe, about 30 inches in diameter, that ran from the basement utility room directly through the granite foundation and terminated into the ocean, several feet below the normal low tide mark. This pipe had been sealed off decades ago, but was still structurally sound, running horizontally to the ocean before dropping off the rock face. The realization struck Detective Reed with quiet force. The lighthouse, this fortress of granite, had an unsealed secret passageway, the underground cistern pipe. The escape was now a matter of engineering and tide tables. Arthur, the meticulous keeper, would have known the exact tidal patterns for that specific Friday morning. The only time the outer end of the pipe would be accessible or even slightly exposed was during the extremely low tide of the pre-dawn hours. This explained the timing. The team next turned its attention to the mechanism of the locked door. Arthur had left the keys inside, but the heavy door was bolted shut. How did he engage the deadbolt from the outside after his departure? Returning to the office, the investigators noticed a small, almost invisible scorch mark near the top of the interior door frame. This led to the old, unused boiler exhaust flue, a thin, vertical metal tube that ran from the basement up through the office and terminated just above the door. This flue was usually sealed. They realized Arthur had used a custom-made tool, a long, stiff wire fashioned from a piece of brass cleaning equipment that he had threaded up the exhaust flue. Once outside the main door, he could have pulled the wire, which was attached to the key hook on the inside wall. With a sharp tug, he could lift and secure the deadbolt mechanism, making the door appear locked from the inside, even though no key was present. This was the final piece of the puzzle. Arthur had created a temporary physical lock and then staged the keys to imply he was still inside. The keys and the packed lunch were not symbols of innocence. They were decoys of domesticity, designed to throw the initial investigation off his true watery trail. The crime had ceased to be a simple mystery of who did it, and had become a detailed study of how a man with infinite patience broke his own security. The mystery had been unmasked. Arthur Jennings was not a victim of the sea, nor of a shadowy intruder. He was the author of his own disappearance, an inside job executed with the chilling precision of a machine. The next step for Sheriff Reed was the methodical, painstaking reconstruction of the escape. They needed to prove that the theoretically possible was factually executed. The entire timetable revolved around the tidal cycle. Arthur, as the keeper, had access to records detailing the lowest tides, the so-called spring tides, which would briefly expose the mouth of the old decommissioned seaward pipe. Reed consulted the maritime charts. The tide on that particular Friday morning was an unusually low ebb, occurring precisely at 4:15 a.m., well before the arrival of the 9 a.m. ferry and long before anyone on the mainland would have thought to check on him. Arthur's final night of duty would have been one of meticulous, quiet preparation. He would have used his specialized knowledge of the safe's small inherent weakness to complete the manipulation, retrieving the gold coins. He then placed the heavy, $250,000 haul into a waterproof satchel, a piece of equipment likely disguised as a heavy maintenance bag or perhaps an old diving kit, anticipating the cold water and the rough crawl. The evidence suggested that he staged the scene perfectly to appear as a sudden mid-morning vanishing act. The packed lunch and the keys left on the counter were decoys of normalcy, designed to imply that his departure was unplanned or involuntary. But his final actions in the basement were the key to the entire paradox. The team descended into the lighthouse foundation to inspect the antique blueprints against the physical reality. They confirmed the existence of the narrow, horizontal cistern pipe. It was cramped, dark, and challenging, but traversable by a man of Arthur's lean build. This was the one exit that bypassed every single formal security measure. He simply crawled out of his fortress using the plumbing as his secret path. Now for the door. The main granite and steel door, the one found locked from the inside, presented the biggest physical hurdle. How did a man, already outside, make the lock appear engaged? The answer lay in the small scorch mark and the old, unused boiler exhaust flue found in the office. This flue ran a discrete course from the basement up to the main floor. The meticulous reconstruction revealed Arthur's clever solution. He threaded his custom-made, stiff brass wire, the one fashioned from a lighthouse cleaning rod, up the flue. He had patiently practiced feeding the wire through the pipe and out a small, almost undetectable crack near the top of the door frame. Before climbing into the pipe and into the cold darkness below, he would have affixed the brass wire to the key hook on the inside wall. Once outside, using the final inches of the wire, Arthur simply gave a smooth, sustained pull. This gentle action was enough to lift the key hook, engaging the internal latch or deadbolt mechanism, giving the impression of an undisturbed, locked interior. He then retracted the wire, leaving no evidence of its use, and tossed the cleaning rod into the ocean. The action was brilliant, utilizing existing mundane infrastructure to create the illusion of an unbroken seal. The execution was now clear. Arthur Jennings, the predictable keeper, had spent years studying his own prison, not for escape, but for unauthorized departure and enrichment. He exploited the one vulnerability that the designers of the lighthouse had never considered: the absolute, total access of the long-term, trusted sole occupant. Arthur's final step was the rendezvous. The diving logs found in his secret compartment included several entries referencing a fictitious friend who owned a small fishing trawler. Police traced the radio logs for that morning and found an unlogged short-range transmission just after 4:30 a.m., confirming a silent meetup just beyond the low-tide rocks. Arthur had traded his heavy keeper's clothes for a wetsuit, carried his gold, and slipped out of his life. He was not taken by the sea, he was embraced by his own cleverness and the convenience of an unmarked fishing boat. The lighthouse keeper's vault was empty, and the keeper was gone. The case was no longer a mystery, but a testament to how even the quietest routines can be a mask for the most audacious deception. The only thing left was the silence he left behind. And with the ingenious deception complete, the investigation into the mystery of Arthur Jennings reached its quiet end. The lighthouse keeper's vault was indeed empty, but the crime did not conclude with a dramatic arrest. It ended with a cold, slow realization of betrayal. Arthur Jennings was never found. He became a ghost in the maritime log, another unsolved case filed away with quiet resignation. The official conclusion settled on disappearance at sea with intent to defraud, a label that tried to capture the contradiction of a man escaping his life with such meticulous planning. The gold, valued at $250,000, was never recovered. It vanished into the vast global market, likely laundered through the very same type of anonymous, old-fashioned money orders Arthur had always insisted upon. The insurance company ultimately paid the claim, forever cementing Arthur's escape as a quiet, successful financial scheme executed against his own employer. The cost of automating the lighthouse, they found, was cheaper than employing another human keeper with a secret passion. The lasting impact of the crime was not the financial loss, but the loss of trust in the very idea of routine. Arthur had used his commitment, his decades of unwavering predictability, as his ultimate camouflage. The most secure life turned out to be the most calculated mask. He had proved that the greatest threat to a fortress is not an external attack, but the intimate, patient knowledge of its builder. For the community of Port Haven, the incident became a quiet legend. The lighthouse still stood, but its meaning changed. It was no longer a symbol of steadfast human presence. It became a memorial to human ingenuity and deceit. The granite walls still absorbed the ocean spray, and the light still swept the horizon, but the silence inside was now one of cold, precise machinery, not human habit. The human element, Arthur's deep commitment, and subsequent quiet betrayal had been permanently removed. The lighthouse itself was swiftly automated shortly after the final report. The old seawater cistern pipe was filled with concrete. The antique lock was replaced with digital codes and constant satellite monitoring. The era of the lonely, trusted keeper, a figure of romance and routine, was over, directly due to one man's need for a private fortune. The structure which once required a human presence now only needed a maintenance check every 6 months. The perfect deception resulted in the perfect, silent replacement. But for us, the closing of the case offers a profound sense of quiet resolution. We have journeyed through the mystery, followed the slow, methodical steps of the detective, and uncovered the subtle, mechanical truth. There was no chaos, no raw emotion, only the patient unraveling of a logical puzzle. Now that the story is complete, there is nothing left to fear or to figure out. The complex threads of the narrative have been neatly tied up and filed away. You are no longer required to focus, to analyze, or to worry about the outcome. Allow yourself to let go of the names, the places, and the events. Let the calm, rhythmic sounds around you, the last whispers of the ocean, the gentle hum of the night, gently carry your mind from the state of listening to the state of deep, undisturbed rest. Focus now only on your breathing, in and out, deep, slow, and steady. The rhythm of the ocean is your comfort. The silence of the lighthouse is your peace. You are safe. You are warm. Sleep now. Welcome back to the stillness of the night. Settle in once more, allowing your body to relax and your mind to gently detach from the day's concerns. We leave the outside world and enter a realm of quiet compliance, of ledgers that balance, and of routines that never break. Tonight, we begin to explore a crime committed not with violence, but with tedious, methodical patience. Our scene is the mid-level offices of the Clarion Group, a firm specializing in investment auditing. Imagine a large, modern building in a quiet city center, where the only sounds are the rustle of paper and the low, persistent hum of technology. This is a world where security is measured not by steel doors, but by the absolute, unwavering accuracy of numbers. This world is ruled by spreadsheets, financial reports, and the predictability of the quarterly review. Our central figure is Mr. Wallace Flynn. Wallace was not an executive, he was the internal disbursements auditor. Wallace was 58 years old, and his life was a testament to the power of the schedule. His existence was defined by immaculate, unvarying routine. Every single morning, he arrived at his office building at exactly 7:58 a.m., precisely 2 minutes before the official start of the business day. He would walk to the same coffee station, retrieve his cup, and sit at his desk. His desk was a marvel of organization. Pencils sharpened and lined up, files stacked to the millimeter, and the keyboard positioned at a precise right angle to the desk edge. Wallace's job was critical, yet entirely invisible. He was the gatekeeper. His duty was to meticulously approve every single payment made to outside vendors, verifying invoices, and ensuring absolute compliance with all internal corporate spending policies. Wallace's routines were so deeply ingrained, so fundamentally secure, that his colleagues often forgot he was there. His lunch was always the same: a thermos of soup and a simple sandwich eaten at his desk at 12:15 p.m. His departure time was always 5:02 p.m., after the cleaning crew had already begun their sweep. He was, in effect, the human extension of the balance sheet, reliable, precise, and entirely predictable. It was this very predictability, this profound, deep understanding of the system's inner workings, that allowed his quiet criminal work to begin. Wallace knew the entire structure he was meant to guard better than anyone else in the building. Crucially, he knew the precise financial threshold, a seemingly arbitrary dollar amount, such as $10,000, below which a vendor payment required only his single signature, bypassing the secondary, watchful eye of a department head or a supervisor. This threshold, designed for expediency in small transactions, was his vulnerability. And so, approximately 5 years ago, Wallace quietly created a non-existent entity. He called it Aperture Consultants. Aperture was a ghost, a paper shell. Its only physical presence was a rented P.O. box in a distant commercial facility and a generic tax identification number. It was a consulting company that in reality never held a meeting, never answered a phone call, and certainly never delivered a single report or service. Aperture Consultants' only purpose was to quietly collect a monthly check from the Clarion Group. The amount was always the same, a perfectly round sum, consistently and critically just a whisper below that two-signature approval threshold. The payments were sent out like clockwork on the 15th of every month. The crime was one of patience, of quiet paperwork, and of the slow, methodical betrayal of trust over 60 consecutive months. For 5 long, uneventful years, the small, consistent checks to Aperture Consultants slipped through the Clarion Group's extensive system. They were a collection of small, predictable transactions blending perfectly into the thousands of legitimate vendor payments Wallace approved. He maintained his perfect reputation, and no one, from his immediate manager to the external regulators who focused on larger, sudden cash movements, noticed the phantom firm. The system was meticulously designed to catch large errors, sudden spikes in spending, or missing documentation. It was not designed to catch a pattern built on perfect, small-scale obedience to its own internal rules. The payments were simply too clean, too regular, and too small to trigger any kind of automated alert. They were an anchor of financial symmetry, designed to blend perfectly into the quiet, repetitive background noise of corporate spending. This perfect quietness, this utter lack of deviation, was the single greatest asset in Wallace Flynn's calculated deception. Everything was in order, which, in the world of auditing, is often the very first sign that something is profoundly wrong. For 5 long years, the Clarion Group's internal controls had been perfectly satisfied. The checks to Aperture consultants continued to flow, undisturbed by any alarm. They were quiet, consistent, and utterly compliant. Wallace Flynn had successfully hidden his financial ghost in plain sight, protected by the very silence and routine he was hired to uphold. The system was designed to catch big, loud mistakes, not the soundless, repetitive tapping of a small, calculated fraud. But then, an outside observer arrived. Her name was Miss Evelyn Reed. Evelyn was a financial consultant, brought in for Clarion's annual external audit. She specialized in efficiency, in finding the places where companies were bleeding small amounts of money through unnecessary processes or outdated systems. She was a mathematician who approached auditing not as a confrontation, but as a meditation on the perfection of numbers. Evelyn's arrival was quiet, marked only by her request for massive data exports and her preference for working late in the hushed, empty conference rooms. She spent her days immersed in the digital ocean of the company's expenditures, searching for patterns that were statistically too messy, or, in this case, too clean. As Evelyn reviewed the year's disbursements, scrolling through millions of entries, she began to notice a curious anomaly. This was not a sudden, massive fraudulent withdrawal. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible detail. She saw the payments to Aperture consultants. There was nothing outwardly wrong with them. They were signed, dated, and accompanied by the correct internal codes. But the amounts were always, without fail, perfectly rounded figures, and they were always, consistently, just below the $10,000 approval threshold. This sheer perfection was what bothered Evelyn. In the real world of consulting, fees fluctuate. They are messy. Hours are billed at $97.50 per hour, leading to totals like $9,873.50, or $9,921. But Aperture's bill was always, relentlessly, $9,950, or similar round figures. It was an anchor of financial symmetry, a fixed point in a sea of fluctuating numbers. It was statistically too neat to be the result of organic, human billing practices. Evelyn realized she wasn't looking at an honest transaction. She was looking at a mathematical footprint. This perfection was the silent alarm. She understood that a transaction this flawless could only be achieved by someone who knew the exact rules of the system and intentionally engineered the payment to bypass scrutiny. She began the slow, arduous process of pulling the historical paper records. This involved descending into the basement archives, a cold, dusty world far removed from the digital screens upstairs. She searched for every invoice sent by Aperture Consultants over the entire 5-year period. She wasn't searching for a dramatic failure. She was searching for the subtle signature of purposeful intent. As she sifted through the hard copy records, the carbon paper copies, the old stamps, she confirmed her suspicion. Each invoice was identical in its bland vagueness, claiming services like general advisory or data structuring support. There were no detailed breakdowns, no lists of deliverables, and no accompanying reports. They were placeholders, perfectly structured to meet the minimal requirements of Wallace Flynn's internal checklist. Evelyn traced the payments back to their digital origin. The recurring payment request form was always generated and approved by one individual, Wallace Flynn, the meticulous internal auditor. He was the person signing the payment, and he was the person submitting the request for the payment. He was acting as both the guardian and the thief. The full weight of the deception settled over Evelyn. She understood that the trail didn't begin with a mistake or a greedy snap decision. It began with a long-term, specific, calmly calculated plan. Wallace had been meticulously seeding the company's ledger with his phantom firm for years, trusting that the sheer boredom and consistency of the payments would act as his perfect camouflage. He had exploited the system not by violence or digital hacking, but by using the company's own rules against itself. The next step was to expose the financial ghost by following the few faint tracks it had left outside the company walls. Evelyn Reed's task was not to run a violent chase, but to execute a financial deep dive. She needed to prove that Aperture Consultants, the phantom firm, was controlled entirely by Wallace Flynn. Her investigation became a study in sustained attention, a quiet war against a paper trail meticulously designed to bore any potential auditor into abandoning the pursuit. She knew the fraud was subtle, so her counterattack had to be even more patient and methodical. She began by analyzing the physical evidence of the ghost firm. She compared 60 months of invoices, all identical in their presentation, always delivered on the 10th of the month. She checked the sequential invoice numbers. They were perfect, never skipping a digit, reinforcing the illusion of a steady, professional business. The level of detail in the invoices was the key. They provided zero verifiable details of service, using only vague, generic language like data structuring support or strategic advisory. There was no record of meetings, no hours billed, and no final deliverables. The documents were crafted merely to satisfy the minimal internal requirements of a quick glance. Evelyn's team then worked to trace the ghost's physical presence outside the Clarion Group. The only physical address listed was a P.O. box. This was traced to a large, anonymous, and unstaffed commercial mail facility located several miles away on the quiet industrial edge of the city. P.O. boxes are designed to provide anonymity, and this one performed that function perfectly. There were hundreds of boxes, and no attendant was tasked with monitoring the contents or the individuals who came to collect the mail. Wallace could retrieve his checks in absolute isolation, simply an anonymous figure visiting a metallic wall of boxes. Next, they tracked the ultimate destination of the money. The checks were deposited into a bank account held at a major financial institution. The account was registered under a generic business name, something utterly forgettable. However, tracing the account ownership required legal paperwork. Once the bank was compelled to release the data, the account records led directly back to a private holding company that, in turn, was registered to Wallace Flynn's own home address. This was the first major break in the silence. Wallace had been careful, but his love of a clean transaction and his ultimate need to access the money led him to register the final holding company in his own name. He had protected the initial layers of the fraud, but not the final step of ownership. The most damning piece of evidence, however, was hidden within the firm's tax identification number, the 9-digit code Wallace had provided for Aperture Consultants. Evelyn's team discovered that this number did not belong to Aperture. It belonged to an entirely different, legitimate consulting business, a local firm that had been inactive and formally dissolved over a decade ago. Wallace had simply recycled the ID of a completely forgotten entity. He was counting on the sheer volume of data and the lack of historical cross-referencing to protect him. He was relying on the laziness of others. The paper trail, which had been designed to lead nowhere, was undone by its own lack of creativity. Wallace was a man of routine, and even his elaborate fraud was unoriginal at its core. He had chosen the path of least resistance, recycling old identities and using perfectly rounded numbers. This utter predictability was the psychological signature that Evelyn was seeking. Evelyn now had definitive proof that Wallace Flynn, the quiet man of the consistent routine, was the sole orchestrator of the phantom payments. The total amount embezzled, accumulated over 5 years of these small monthly transactions, was substantial. Yet the mystery of the motive remained. There were no signs of sudden large wealth. The next most critical step was to look beyond the numbers and uncover what quiet indulgence Wallace was funding with his meticulously stolen funds. The search turned away from corporate ledgers and toward the private life of the quiet auditor. Evelyn Reed now held all the pieces of the puzzle: the pattern of the phantom payments, the recycled tax ID, and the consistent signature of Wallace Flynn. Yet the missing piece was the motive. The money, accumulated over 5 years of small transactions, was substantial. But Wallace still lived in the same modest suburban home and drove his reliable, unremarkable sedan. The stolen funds were not being spent on the flashy, obvious indulgences that typically mark a financial crime. The crime was quiet. The spending had to be too. Evelyn turned away from the corporate ledgers and focused on the scant details of Wallace's private life. She reviewed his professional certifications and registrations. Most were predictable: certifications in accounting standards, digital auditing, and corporate compliance. But a single unusual detail in his public records caught her eye. Wallace was a licensed, registered member of the National Guild of Horological Restoration. Horology, the study and meticulous restoration of antique clocks and timepieces. This was his single hidden passion. This was the silent destination of the embezzled funds. Wallace Flynn was not buying yachts or exotic travel. He was funding an extremely expensive, highly technical hobby. The money from Aperture Consultants was not used for destructive greed, but for the quiet, solitary purchase of rare, century-old timepieces and the specialized tools required to restore them. He favored purchasing these fragile antiques from private collectors and specialized brokers who, like himself, preferred untraceable, cash-only transactions. The gold coins for the lighthouse keeper, the antique clocks for the quiet auditor. Both men chose solitary, specific passions that required absolute privacy and immense quiet funding. The clocks were Wallace's own perfect routine, physical mechanisms requiring the same methodical, non-emotional precision that he applied to his work. In a way, he had used the company's finances to buy his own private perfection. Evelyn, respecting the gravity of the situation and the methodical nature of the man, arranged a final, private meeting with Wallace. The confrontation was not a raid, but a quiet, calculated conversation in a small, neutral conference room. Evelyn ensured the atmosphere remained calm, professional, and entirely non-accusatory. Wallace entered the room at 10 a.m. precisely. He was immaculate, wearing a neatly pressed suit and carrying his usual thermos. Evelyn did not lead with the fraud. She started by genuinely complimenting the quiet, perfect symmetry of his payment disbursements, noting that they were the cleanest, most consistent records she had ever seen. Wallace, ever precise, politely acknowledged the compliment, a faint flicker of pride showing on his usually blank face. Then, slowly and methodically, Evelyn began to lay out the evidence. She started with the statistical anomaly of the perfectly rounded payment figures. She moved to the full 5-year history of the false documentation. She then presented the final inescapable links: the expired tax ID, the unused P.O. box, and the fact that the money trail ultimately led back to a holding company registered at his own address. There were no raised voices, there were no accusations, only facts presented in sequence. Wallace listened to the entire devastating presentation, his face betraying nothing, his hands resting calmly and quietly on the table. When she finished, there was a long, deep silence, broken only by the low, even hum of the ventilation system and the faint ticking of the clock in the corner. Finally, Wallace quietly nodded. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible. He didn't deny the crime. He simply acknowledged the flawless logic of Evelyn's audit. Then he started talking. He spoke not about the money, but about the mechanism. He detailed the timing, the financial thresholds he had maintained, and the beautiful flaw of the system's design. The crime for him was not an act of destructive greed, but the act of technical mastery, allowing him to maintain his quiet, professional facade while funding his obsession with the perfect, quiet movement of time. He had broken the rules, but only by following them perfectly. The quiet confrontation in the conference room concluded without struggle, without malice, and without a single raised voice. Wallace Flynn, having completed his detailed verbal surrender, signed a full confession. He was immediately and quietly escorted from the premises. The internal audit, spearheaded by Evelyn Reed, was complete. The case of the phantom consultant was closed out with the same chilling efficiency with which Wallace had orchestrated his crime. Because the embezzlement was entirely nonviolent and primarily documentation-based, a crime of paperwork, not of force, the legal process proceeded without any major public scandal. The company preferred to handle the matter discreetly. It became a series of quiet court filings, settlements, and legal paperwork, a narrative played out in the private records of the courthouse. Wallace was eventually sentenced to a relatively short term of home confinement, acknowledging his cooperation and the nonviolent nature of the theft. Critically, Wallace was ordered to pay full restitution to the Clarion Group. He accomplished this by liquidating his greatest love, his extensive and valuable collection of antique timepieces. The proceeds from the sale of his specialized clocks and horological tools were enough to cover the entirety of the embezzled funds. His quiet, perfect crime ultimately funded nothing but his own quiet, perfect downfall. His obsession with the mechanism of time was paid for by the loss of his own freedom and his collection. The Clarion Group spent the next several months meticulously cleaning up the phantom paper trail. Every digital and physical entry for Aperture Consultants was permanently deleted from their ledgers. The financial hole was filled, and the accounting anomaly was corrected. The firm installed new, automated digital checks designed to flag any vendor invoice that consistently arrives at the same amount, especially if it falls just below a critical approval threshold. The system, once violated by its own guardian, was made secure not by distrust, but by better programming. The firm learned the hard way that when the human element is too predictable, the computer must be taught to look for perfection as a sign of fraud. The office environment returned to its original state of calm, predictable routine. Wallace Flynn was gone, and the silence he left behind was filled only by the gentle hum of the office machinery. The numbers on the spreadsheets once again added up perfectly. The system, having weathered the internal violation, became more resilient. This story is a testament to how even the most precise routines can be a mask for the most profound personal obsession, and how the careful, methodical work of an auditor can restore balance to the chaotic world of human desire. And that is where we leave the case of the phantom consultant. The ledgers have been balanced, the investigations are filed away, and the facts are settled. There are no more knots to untangle, no more secrets to uncover. The complexity of the scheme has been reduced to a simple, quiet entry in a long-forgotten file. The story has done its work. Now it's time for your mind to let go of the details, the numbers, the deadlines, and the quiet betrayal. You are no longer required to focus, to analyze, or to remain vigilant. Let the final, gentle sounds of the night be your companions. Focus only on the smooth, quiet rhythm of your own breathing. Feel the slow, steady ticking of time, a gentle, continuous sound that demands nothing of you but rest. Let the soft hum of the air around you carry your mind from the state of listening into the state of deep, undisturbed slumber. You are safe, you are warm. Sleep now. We take a gentle journey now, leaving the cold logic of finance behind and entering the hushed, cavernous silence of a university library archive. Allow your mind to settle into the stillness of history. It is the late 1980s. Our setting is the rare book room of the esteemed Cromwell University Library, a space where the air is cool, the light is dim, and time seems to move at the slow pace of aging parchment. Here, history is not taught, it is preserved, protected behind velvet ropes and climate-controlled glass. Our subject is an object of quiet, incalculable value, the Isleworth Psalter. This is no ordinary book. It is a medieval manuscript, painstakingly illustrated and illuminated by hand centuries ago. It is a work of art, a piece of religious history, and a treasure that requires the highest level of protection. The Psalter resides in a specialized, steel-reinforced, fireproof vault located deep within the Cromwell archives. The protector of this treasure is Dr. Julian Vance, the curator of rare manuscripts at Cromwell University. Dr. Vance was a man whose entire life was an echo of the stillness of his collection. He was a quiet, meticulous academic, deeply rooted in the history he protected. He had spent his career in the archives, finding comfort and certainty in the predictable decay and preservation of ancient materials. Dr. Vance's entire daily routine was unwavering and almost ceremonial. Every morning he arrived at 7 a.m. sharp. He retrieved his coffee from the small kitchenette and immediately began his first ritual, a meticulous, solitary check of the manuscript vault. He didn't monitor the artifacts with suspicion of theft. He monitored them with an academic's reverence and a scientist's dedication to checking temperature, humidity, and atmospheric stability. He genuinely believed that the greatest, most insidious enemy of the collection was not a thief, but the slow, corrosive forces of humidity and time. His trust in the quiet security of the academic world and the innate goodness of scholars was absolute. But the world outside the vault was indeed growing less quiet. An annual international conference on medieval history was scheduled to begin at Cromwell University, drawing dozens of renowned specialists, visiting scholars, and significantly, a few powerful, high-value art and manuscript collectors from around the globe. The Isleworth Psalter, naturally, was to be the centerpiece of the viewing, a display of the university's quiet prestige. Dr. Vance, though nervous about the sudden increase in traffic and the sheer number of eyes that would pass over his domain, took every precaution. For the entire week leading up to the conference, he manually verified the seals and alarms every single evening double-checking the motion sensors and the pressure plates before he finally departed at 8 p.m. He was a man ensuring that his world of order remained intact before the storm of public attention arrived. The first day of the conference finally arrived, bringing with it a low hum of quiet intellectual excitement and anticipation throughout the university halls. Dr. Vance, adhering precisely to his familiar routine, performed his 7 a.m. security check. The main reading room was empty. The outer door to the heavy vault was sealed. The red indicator light confirmed the electrical systems were fully engaged. Everything to the casual eye appeared to be in its assigned place, confirming the absolute stability of his controlled environment. However, a new small procedural step introduced after a recent insurance review required him to manually inspect the internal humidity sensors located directly inside the manuscript vault. He approached the vault door. He entered the complex combination, a sequence he had memorized and used hundreds of times, and the heavy steel door, designed to weigh several tons, swung open silently on its oiled hinges. The air inside the vault was cool, sterile, and still, exactly as it should be. The custom-built cushioned display stand, meticulously designed for the weight and size of the Psalter, was precisely where it belonged, spotlit by a soft directional lamp. But the Isleworth Psalter itself was gone. The small designated space was empty. There was no broken glass, no sign of tampering on the heavy steel lock, and absolutely no sign of forced entry marring the protective velvet lining of the stand. The alarms, linked to motion, heat, and pressure sensors, were completely silent. Dr. Vance did not scream or run. He simply stopped, his mind processing the profound, absolute stillness of the absence. His first instinct was not to call the police, but to calmly cross-reference the archive's digital and physical internal logs. The logs confirmed that the last time the Psalter was recorded as in place was at 8 p.m. the previous evening, when Dr. Vance had completed his final meticulous check. The main alarm system had not been triggered, not once, between 8 p.m. and his 7 a.m. entry. This meant the thief had either been inside the vault before the alarm was set, or knew the master access code and the intricate methods of bypassing the interior sensors without activating the motion detection. The investigation was immediately taken over by the university's internal security team and the local police, led by Elias Shaw. Shaw's initial briefing was unique. He was tasked with solving a crime where the object was worth millions, but the only evidence left behind was the absence of disorder. It was a theft committed by silence and deep, intimate knowledge. The most critical question was immediately clear. Who, besides Dr. Vance, possessed the complex, specialized knowledge required to bypass 3 layers of university security without raising a single, solitary alarm? Detective Elias Shaw stood in the silent, temperature-controlled vault, examining the empty velvet stand. The absence of the Isleworth Psalter was deafening. The initial forensic sweep confirmed the curator's report. No broken windows, no forced locks, no sign of any struggle whatsoever. The thief had been a ghost of efficiency. This absence of evidence was the central, critical clue. It meant the crime was not a smash and grab by an outsider. It was an act of intimate, calculated knowledge. The investigation immediately turned inward, focusing on the small, insulated circle of individuals who possessed legitimate, long-term access and authority over the manuscript vault and its highly specialized security systems. This was not a hunt for common criminals. It was a quiet, intellectual dissection of professional trust. The potential suspects were few. They were academics, they were technicians, and they were, by necessity, people of routine and patience. The inner circle of suspects consisted of 4 key individuals. First, Dr. Julian Vance himself, the curator, who by protocol was the immediate subject of scrutiny. Second, Dr. Vance's junior assistant, a recent graduate named Sarah, whose access was primarily during daylight hours and limited to the outer reading room. Third, the head of the university's Central Security Technical Team, a man named Mark, who knew the placement of every wire, alarm panel, and emergency power supply within the library, but whose access to the final vault combination was severely limited by internal checks. And finally, a long-standing, well-regarded figure within the archive world, Mr. Alastair Finch, a book restorer who frequently worked in the archive on contract. Detective Shaw established that Dr. Vance, though initially the prime suspect due to his intimate knowledge of the vault code, was quietly cleared. His financial profile, meticulously reviewed by a specialist team, showed no sudden movements, no hidden debts, and no extravagant purchases. His life was as clean and consistent as his work log. His assistant, Sarah, was similarly ruled out. While her hours overlapped, she lacked the highly technical knowledge required to circumvent the vault's complex interior motion sensors. The investigation narrowed, focusing intensely on the security technician, Mark, and the book restorer, Alastair Finch. The technician, Mark, presented an interesting possibility. He knew the location of every pressure plate and every heat sensor in the vault. His technical expertise was unmatched, but his movements within the archive were logged and audited by an external firm, making it exceptionally difficult for him to spend the required time alone with the vault door. Alastair Finch, the restorer, presented a quieter, more subtle threat. Finch had spent the past 8 weeks working inside the archive, often remaining alone after closing hours, working near the vault on other sensitive, albeit less valuable artifacts. He was known for his patient hands and his deep, profound knowledge of historical bookbinding and the chemical composition of old parchment. He was a man of quiet, sustained focus. He had the opportunity, the cover of professional duty, and the inherent knowledge of the texture and chemistry of the archive itself. Detective Shaw, unable to rely on conventional evidence, ordered a thorough review of the archive's specialized air filtration logs. These logs were designed to monitor the environment for dust, spores, and chemical contaminants that could harm the manuscripts. What the logs revealed was a subtle, almost imperceptible pattern. For a period of exactly 2 hours every evening for the past week, a very small, highly specific section of the air filters, located just outside the vault entrance, had experienced a slight, momentary spike in dust particulates, The level was far too low to trigger a general chemical alarm, but it was an unusual environmental perturbation in the otherwise sterile environment. The police theorized that this spike was caused by the application of a specialized chemical compound, specifically a silicon polymer or highly refined sealant, being used to temporarily seal or neutralize the hypersensitive motion and pressure plates embedded in the vault's floor and walls. This material, applied carefully, would suppress the electronic sensors just long enough for the thief to enter and exit the vault without triggering any motion or pressure alarms. The dust spike represented the minute particles released during the careful application of this temporary sealant. This realization fundamentally shifted the focus of the case. The crime was no longer about brute force or lock-picking. It was about chemical knowledge and patient timing. The material would suppress the sensors just long enough for the thief to work, and would then dry out and crumble, leaving virtually no trace. This pointed the investigation directly and definitively toward someone who was able to access and formulate specialized, non-standard chemical materials, someone with the quiet expertise of a master restorer. The academic world, it seemed, harbored the tools for its own quiet undoing. Detective Elias Shaw now had a clear hypothesis. The theft of the Isleworth Psalter was a meticulously planned inside job, executed by someone with both access and specialized chemical knowledge. The physical evidence was minimal, a missing manuscript and a locked door. But the environmental evidence spoke volumes. The 2-hour spike in dust particulates in the air filtration system, located just outside the vault, was the faint, crucial signature of the thief. The key to solving the case lay in understanding the chemical composition of that dust spike. The police forensic team analyzed the air filter residue and confirmed the presence of minute traces of a silicon polymer and a specialized drying agent. This was a bespoke material, formulated to remain pliable just long enough to suppress the sensors, and then dry quickly without leaving a visible or tacky film. This compound was highly specialized, not something available in a standard hardware store or the university's janitorial closet. It required the quiet expertise of a master craftsman, someone who worked intimately with sensitive materials. This realization led Detective Shaw and his team to focus their entire quiet attention on the single individual who fit this unique profile, the long-standing, respected book restorer, Mr. Alastair Finch. Finch was not merely a repairman. He was an artist and a chemist of historical materials. He possessed the exact knowledge necessary to formulate a temporary silicon compound that would neutralize the electrical conductivity of a pressure sensor without leaving a visible or permanent trace. Furthermore, he would know precisely how long the compound needed to remain active before it dried and flaked away into invisible dust, the very dust that was captured by the archive's filtration system. Finch had spent the last 8 weeks working in the archive, enjoying extensive, unsupervised access after regular closing hours. His work required him to be meticulous, focused, and intensely patient. He used his legitimate cover, the quiet work of preserving other manuscripts, to conduct his true work, the methodical, careful observation of Dr. Vance's nightly routine, and the subtle mapping of the vault's security vulnerabilities. The investigation now pieced together Finch's careful steps leading up to the silent theft. Finch had patiently studied Dr. Vance's closing routine, noting the exact moment the curator set the final alarms before departing at 8 p.m. More damningly, the search of the archive revealed a tiny, unmarked memo book used by Dr. Vance to track ambient humidity and temperature fluctuations. Tucked into the back of this book, written in a cramped, familiar hand, was the single, most protected piece of knowledge in the entire facility, the master combination to the vault door. Dr. Vance, trusting his own absolute solitude and adherence to routine, had mistakenly believed his own tiny note was safely hidden from the world. Finch, working nearby for 2 months, would have had the opportunity to observe or quietly copy the combination when Dr. Vance left the book unattended for a brief moment. The human element, the flaw in the keeper's routine, was the combination. Finch had not needed to break the lock. He had simply needed the code and the chemical knowledge to temporarily blind the internal sensors. The entire theft was a masterpiece of time management and chemical stealth. On the night of the theft, Finch would have completed his restoration work, waiting until after Dr. Vance departed and the general alarms were set. Then, using a tiny specialized applicator, likely a tool disguised as a conservation instrument, he quietly applied the silicone compound to the critical motion and pressure sensor plates located just inside the vault area. He then waited a patient 2 hours for the compound to begin its work, suppressing the sensors just enough. He entered the combination, and the heavy door swung silently open, and he entered a space that, to the sensors, was utterly empty and undisturbed. He removed the salter, meticulously replaced the final seals on the display stand to conceal the removal until morning, and then exited the archive, leaving no trace but the faint chemical evidence caught by the air filters. The absence of disorder was not an accident. It was a carefully manufactured condition, a signature of the specialist. The profound stillness of the crime was now understood not as a ghost story, but as a meticulously executed technical procedure. The focus now shifted to locating the thief and the stolen history. The evidence, meticulously gathered from the silent archives, had formed a clear, undeniable picture. The missing manuscript was not the result of a spectacular outside breach. It was the product of intimate knowledge and chemical preparation, pointing only to the book restorer, Alistair Finch. Detective Shaw now possessed the crucial signature, the analysis of the air filter residue, which had confirmed the presence of the highly specialized silicone polymer, a compound designed to temporarily disable electronic sensors. A book restorer, unlike a security technician, would possess the intricate chemical understanding necessary to formulate such a sensitive, temporary compound. They would also know the exact curing time, ensuring the material would suppress the sensors for the critical period and then dry, leaving almost no forensic trace. This was a crime of professional expertise turned to illicit gain. With the chemical evidence in hand, The police obtained a warrant to search Finch's small off-campus studio and workshop. The search was quiet and methodical, focusing on the tools of his trade. They found no sign of the massive, unique Isleworth Psalter. Finch was too clever to keep the treasure close to his workspace. But the search did reveal something equally damning: a meticulously organized shelf of highly specialized chemical compounds, solvents, and various application tools. Among them was a recently used container of a silicone sealant whose precise chemical signature matched the minute residue captured by the archive's filtration system. This was the silent, physical proof needed to connect Finch directly to the method of the theft. The investigation now needed to piece together the entire quiet sequence, confirming every step of the meticulous crime. Finch, during his many late evening shifts, had spent weeks patiently observing Dr. Vance's patterns. He noted the exact time the curator set the final alarm before departing at 8 p.m. He also discovered the crucial flaw: Dr. Vance's small, unmarked memo book, used for recording humidity and temperature, was where the curator had scribbled the master vault combination, relying on the obscurity of his own routine for security. The resolution was now built on a timetable. On the evening of the theft, Finch executed the sequence perfectly. He waited until the central alarm system was armed. He used his specialized knowledge to apply the silicone compound to the critical motion and pressure plates just inside the vault area. He then waited patiently for the optimal 2 hours for the compound to begin its work, suppressing the sensors just enough to allow physical movement. Using the combination copied from the memo book, he entered the vault. The heavy door swung silently open. He removed the Psalter, which he had already prepared for transport, by wrapping it in layers of protective archival canvas. His final brilliant act of deception was to replace the seals on the display stand, making the empty space appear untouched until the morning. He then exited the archive, leaving no disorder, only the faint chemical evidence that led to his eventual capture. The absence of a visible crime was in fact the most telling sign of his specialized signature. Confronted with the overwhelming chemical and circumstantial evidence, the matched silicone, the access, and the discovery of the hidden memo book, Alistair Finch quietly confessed. He revealed that he had been operating on behalf of a wealthy, anonymous private collector, not for his own financial gain, but commissioned for the challenge and the massive payout. The collector simply wished to possess the historical beauty of the manuscript for a private, permanent display, away from the public eye. The confession immediately led police to a climate-controlled storage locker miles away, where the Isleworth Psalter was recovered intact, still wrapped carefully in protective canvas, undamaged by its brief absence. The most valuable piece of history was saved, protected by the quick, methodical work of Detective Shaw. The system had been violated by human trust, but the history was preserved. The entire quiet world of the academic archive could now begin the slow process of sealing its wounds. The capture of Finch and the recovery of the Psalter brought the silent, baffling crime to its unhurried, decisive conclusion. The focus now shifts entirely to the aftermath and the quiet lessons learned from this breach of trust. The quiet resolution of the crime brought a profound sense of closure to the Cromwell University archive. The thief, Alistair Finch, was contained, and the valuable Isleworth Psalter was recovered intact. It was returned to its custom-built, cushioned stand, untouched and undamaged by its brief criminal absence. The system had suffered a severe methodical breach of trust, but the history itself was preserved. The legal aftermath was swift and non-grammatic. Finch faced charges related to grand larceny and breaking and entering. His expertise, which was the very key to his crime, became a factor in his sentencing. The court acknowledged the non-destructive nature of his theft. He stole the artifact but meticulously preserved its condition, but emphasized the gross violation of trust within the academic community. Finch was ultimately sentenced to a term in federal prison, closing the door on his career as a master restorer. The specialized knowledge that allowed him to steal the Psalter now confined him. The recovery was a quiet victory for Dr. Julian Vance and the entire Cromwell University archive. The institution immediately moved to replace the antiquated security protocols. They removed all human set combinations, replacing them with modern digital retina scan and biometric technologies. The quiet, misplaced reliance on a keeper's personal routine was forever replaced by the unwavering, objective reliability of silicon and code. The incident became a mandatory training case study, a cold, hard lesson that trust, in the world of multi-million-dollar artifacts, must always be secondary to automated security. The archive slowly, deliberately returned to its essential stillness. The historical truth was preserved, protected once more by thick walls and the renewed, digitized dedication of the curator's team. The system had suffered a profound and embarrassing violation, but the resolution was complete. The academic world was made whole again, leaving behind only the calm satisfaction of justice achieved through methodical investigation and meticulous attention to quiet, subtle detail. The final paper trail confirmed the recovery, confirmed the sentence, and confirmed the installation of the new, updated systems. Everything was, once again, accounted for. This story, like the slow, methodical work of the book restorer, reveals a truth about obsession and quiet deception. Both the lighthouse keeper and the book restorer were men of deep, patient routine. They did not succumb to chaotic violence or sudden urges. Their crimes were slow, years in the making, and designed to leverage their intimate knowledge of the very structures they were tasked with protecting. Their stories offer a unique kind of comfort, the recognition that even the most complex human deceptions are ultimately predictable and resolvable. The puzzle is solved, the threat is removed, and the chaos is neatly filed away in the records. There are no loose ends. There is only finality. The museum and its treasures are safe. Dr. Vance is back to his predictable routine. The archive doors are sealed, and the light is dim. All external disturbances have been eliminated. The time for analyzing the crime is over. The time for rest has arrived. The purpose of this final segment is to provide cognitive closure. Your mind no longer needs to work to solve the puzzle, to anticipate the next threat, or to worry about the outcome. The thief is contained, the manuscript is safe, and the quiet of the archive is restored. Allow the gentle, consistent, and rhythmic sounds around you to draw your mind toward the quietude of sleep. Feel the slow, even movement of your breath. Let the distant, soft sound of the environment take over, asking nothing more of you than deep, peaceful relaxation. There are no more secrets to uncover, only the gentle satisfaction of the night settling in. The system is secure. The story is over. You are calm. You are secure. Sleep now. We take a quiet journey now, turning away from the intricate mechanisms of the archive and the cold spray of the sea. We settle instead into the peaceful, unremarkable setting of a small American town in the late 1990s. This is a place where life moves slowly, where every face is familiar, and where trust is easily and freely given. This is where we find the unassuming heart of our next story. Our central figure is Mr. Daniel Thorne. Daniel was a quiet, gentle man in his mid-40s, working a steady, entirely routine job at the local public library. His life was defined by its absolute stillness. He was a creature of absolute habit, marked only by his evening walks to a quiet park and his deep personal dedication to the classic works of literature he shelved each day. He was a man utterly invisible in the quiet, comforting fabric of his community. If a person could embody the idea of predictable peace, it was Daniel Thorne. The peace of this small town, however, was about to be fractured. Over several months, a series of small-scale bank robberies had occurred in the neighboring communities. The robberies were unique because they were always conducted with extreme caution. The thief was never violent, never loud, and he always ensured his escape was quick and clean, blending back into the anonymity of the nearby highway. The robberies created a quiet, creeping sense of fear, a persistent feeling of vulnerability that this small, trusting town was unprepared to handle. The local police department was under immense, continuous pressure from the press and the anxious town council to find a culprit. They needed a resolution, and they needed it quickly to restore the feeling of safety that had been stolen along with the cash. In the midst of this urgent, low-grade panic, Daniel Thorne's quiet life was catastrophically upended. His involvement began with a series of minor, misleading coincidences. Several eyewitnesses, when questioned about the quiet thief, offered vague descriptions, mentioning a man of average height, wearing wire-rimmed glasses, and possessing a somewhat reserved, polite demeanor. Due to these imprecise accounts and the police's growing desperation to close the case, Daniel Thorne was brought in for questioning. The police were eager, and they interpreted Daniel's quiet, nervous demeanor not as the natural shyness of a bookish man unaccustomed to confrontation, but as a deliberate sign of guilt. He was held for questioning, and the interrogation became intense and prolonged. The detectives, driven by the urgency of the local crisis, repeatedly insisted that Daniel was their man. They insisted that he simply had to admit to the robberies and that his difficult situation would immediately cease. Daniel was exhausted. He was anxious. He was kept awake and under relentless duress for many hours. Under this intense, crushing psychological pressure, Daniel, the quiet man who simply wanted to return to his library and his routine, eventually did the unthinkable. He offered a false confession. He was a quiet man, overwhelmed by the volume and intensity of the situation, and desperately signed a document admitting to the small-scale bank robberies that he absolutely did not commit. The police had their written admission. The case was, to their minds, swiftly and decisively closed. The press reported the story. The local council expressed relief, and the town could take a shallow, immediate sigh relief. Daniel Thorne was quickly tried and sentenced. His gentle, predictable life instantly replaced by the sterile, rigid, and entirely undeserved routine of a state prison. The local legal system focused heavily on the expediency of a quick resolution, had accepted the signed written confession as the ultimate, unassailable, and final piece of truth. The actual investigation stopped the moment Daniel put his name to the paper. But the paper held only the appearance of truth. It was a visible and loud assertion that silenced the small, quiet facts hidden in the background. The true story of the crime and the error in Daniel's conviction lay in the contradictory evidence that the initial rushed investigation had entirely overlooked. Facts that existed in the mundane records of a local library and the scientific quietness of a medical file. The true story had just begun, buried under the weight of a signature. The small-town legal system, content with the easy finality of a signed document, had declared the case against Daniel Thorne closed. The community felt a manufactured sense of security, and Daniel's quiet life was replaced by the cold, silent routine of a state prison cell. The police had their culprit, but the truth remained quietly buried within the case file itself. However, the story was not over. A methodical young paralegal named Clara Voss was assigned to Daniel's subsequent quiet appeal. Clara was not motivated by the spectacle of drama or the emotion of injustice. She was motivated purely and relentlessly by the cold, objective language of the facts contained in the dusty archive records. She approached the case file not as a narrative of guilt, but as a complex, technical document that contained discrepancies. Her belief was simple. If the facts did not align with the confession was false. Clara embarked on a long, slow process of meticulous review. She spent weeks patiently going through every page of the initial investigation, cross-referencing police reports against bank surveillance logs and witness statements. She began to find a series of compelling contradictions, small, quiet flaws that the original rushed, politically motivated investigation had deliberately overlooked in its haste to secure a signature. The core of the initial case was the series of small-scale bank robberies, each occurring during very narrow, distinct windows of time. usually mid-morning between 10:30 a.m. and 11 a.m. Clara focused her attention on these precise 30-minute gaps. She pulled the time-stamped security footage from the local library, Daniel Thorne's place of employment. The police had obtained the footage, but had only reviewed it generally, accepting Daniel's alibi without close, frame-by-frame scrutiny. Clara, however, reviewed hundreds of hours of mundane, grainy video. She confirmed with absolute certainty that Daniel Thorne was visible at his post, shelving books, processing returns, and interacting with patrons during the exact moments the bank robberies took place several miles away. The footage was boring, consistent, and irrefutable. It conclusively proved his alibi, yet the police had disregarded it the moment the confession was obtained. The truth was hidden in the visible, mundane routine of his job. Furthermore, the initial investigation had collected several detailed descriptions of the getaway vehicle. Witnesses consistently described a distinctive, older blue pickup truck with a specific model of custom hubcaps. Clara cross-referenced these descriptions with Daniel's motor vehicle records. Daniel owned a modest, aging maroon sedan, a vehicle that differed wildly in color, make, and body style from the descriptions provided by multiple reliable sources. This physical contradiction, the quiet evidence of the vehicle, was simply ignored because it contradicted the finality of the signed document. Clara realized the fundamental flaw in the original work. The police had stopped investigating the crime the moment they had secured the written confession. They had failed to follow up on the very pieces of physical evidence they themselves had collected, evidence that conclusively eliminated their own suspect. The confession was visible and loud, a compelling soundbite for the press, but the truth was hidden in the quiet, mundane details of library records and vehicle logs. The paralegal's task was clear. She realized her job was not to solve the original robbery, but to prove the fallibility of the initial legal process. The core of the appeal became the undeniable fact that the prosecution had prioritized a piece of paper, the confession, over the objective reality contained in the security footage and the vehicle descriptions. Clara was not fighting a narrative of guilt, she was fighting a narrative of investigative laziness. The confession had become a psychological shortcut, a comfortable stopping point for an overworked police force under immense public pressure. She began the long, methodical process of preparing the evidence, organizing the timestamps, and pairing the grainy library images with the precise moments the tellers reported the robbery. Every detail was quiet, tedious, and entirely essential. The focus of the appeal now shifted entirely from proving Daniel's original guilt to proving the absolute innocence hidden within the objective facts. She knew that to secure his release, she had to present the quiet power of documented fact against the loud, emotional failure of the false confession. Clara Voss, the meticulous paralegal, had established two quiet, undeniable truths. First, Daniel Thorne was physically present at the library during the robberies, as proven by the time-stamped footage. Second, his maroon sedan did not match the blue getaway vehicle described by the witnesses. The objective facts of the case, held in the paper files, completely invalidated the narrative of guilt. This left one piece of evidence, one singular point of failure that had sent an innocent man to prison: the confession itself. Clara's attention turned to this central flaw. She obtained the entire investigatory record, which included the full, unedited transcript and the audio recordings of Daniel Thorne's interrogation. This was her deepest dive into the case, a forensic examination not of a crime scene, but of a psychological breakdown. She spent weeks patiently listening to the audio, reviewing the transcripts alongside a meticulous timeline. Her focus was not on the words of the confession itself, but on the rhythm, tone, and pacing of the exchange, the subtle dynamics that revealed the true nature of the event. What she discovered was a methodical process of coercion achieved through sheer, debilitating exhaustion. The interrogation, documented with chilling precision, had lasted for over 18 relentless hours. Daniel was questioned without adequate breaks, without access to familiar support, and without any genuine respite from the relentless pressure. Clara noted the stark difference in Daniel's voice over that time frame. His initial denials, though nervous, were clear and precise. He maintained his innocence with a firm, if anxious, tone for the first 6 hours. But as the clock ticked past midnight and into the next morning, his voice gradually became slurred, low, and fragmented. His answers dwindled to single syllables, and his resistance eroded entirely. The detectives, in contrast, maintained a steady, firm energy, repeatedly insisting that Daniel's complicated life, the stress of being a suspect, the isolation, would instantly resolve itself the moment he simply admitted guilt. They used common, yet highly effective psychological tactics. They insisted they had evidence linking him to the scene, leveraging the anxiety created by the generic eyewitness descriptions. They created a false dichotomy for Daniel: continued agonizing sleepless interrogation, or the immediate comforting finality of the signed confession. Daniel, the quiet man of routine, was cornered, desperate to return to any semblance of his familiar world. Clara focused on the specific moment Daniel finally cracked. She cross-referenced the interrogation time with Daniel's own quiet medical records. Daniel suffered from a mild but long-standing sleep disorder that required strict adherence to his pre-bedtime routine and sleep schedule. By keeping him awake and under duress for nearly a full day, pushing past the point of physical and mental endurance, the police had effectively disabled his cognitive ability to resist. His eventual agreement to confess was not an act of criminal admission, but a statement of mental collapse, a desperate prioritizing of immediate relief over the complex, long-term truth. Further analysis of the confession itself proved its fundamental emptiness. Daniel's final statement was shockingly short, vague, and contained no details about the crime that had not already been clearly supplied to him by the interrogators. When asked to describe the layout of the bank, the type of weapon used, there was no weapon, only a note, or the exact amount of money stolen, Daniel could provide no information. He merely agreed to the narrative given to him, confirming the detective's assumptions rather than providing unique criminal knowledge. The confession was a parrot of the police theory, not a record of genuine events. Clara's legal strategy solidified around this core weakness. The confession was invalid because it was not based on the specific knowledge of the crime, but was instead the desperate, coerced result of psychological torture via sleep deprivation. She now had to present the quiet, scientific facts of Daniel's defense, the library footage, the vehicle discrepancy, and the medical fragility against the loud, accepted finality of the signed paper. She knew the fight would be long, quiet, and deliberate, focusing on the slow, methodical triumph of procedural integrity over investigatory haste. Her work was to resurrect the true facts that the police had mistakenly killed with a signature. Clara Voss had completed her meticulous work. The case file, once a chaotic collection of rushed theories and ignored facts, was now an organized argument for innocence. She carried the weight of her evidence, a quiet weapon against the loud emotional conviction based solely on Daniel Thorne's coerced signature. She carried the weight of her evidence, a quiet weapon against the loud emotional conviction based solely on Daniel Thorne's coerced signature. Her task was to present the quiet facts of the defense, the objective reality, against the comfortable, widely accepted fiction of the confession. The appeals process began, a long, quiet, and deliberate legal battle waged far from the intense scrutiny of the local press. Clara did not seek drama. She sought methodical review. She presented the facts not with outrage, but with the cold, undeniable clarity of irrefutable evidence. The central pillar of her argument was the undisputed library security footage. She presented the time-stamped images showing Daniel Thorne shelving books and assisting patrons at the precise moments to the minute that the bank robberies were being reported several miles away. This was an absolute alibi, a piece of objective data that the original investigators had discounted the moment they secured the confession. The jury of appeals court judges was forced to acknowledge the simple, devastating truth that Daniel could not have been in two places at once. The silent footage spoke louder than any signed statement. Next, Clara introduced the psychological and medical fragility of the confession itself. She detailed the extreme conditions of the 18-hour interrogation, using the audio recordings to document the methodical erosion of Daniel's resistance. She presented the medical evidence regarding his specific sleep disorder, arguing that the prolonged duress had rendered his will powerless, forcing him to confess purely for the sake of immediate desperate relief. The court was forced to hear the audio of Daniel's broken, slurred final agreement, contrasting the strong, clear voice of the interrogators with the weak, compliant whisper of the exhausted suspect. Clara underscored the core flaw. Daniel's confession contained no unique knowledge of the crime. He couldn't describe the bank layouts or the stolen funds, proving that it was entirely based on information supplied to him by the police. The signed document, therefore, was ruled inadmissible. It was a reflection of the interrogator's theory, not the criminal's knowledge. The judges, forced to review the totality of the evidence, the irrefutable alibi, the contradictory physical description of the getaway vehicle, and the invalid nature of the coercion, recognized the fundamental, tragic flaw in the initial conviction. The legal system with its wheels turning slowly but inevitably, issued its ruling. The confession was ruled inadmissible, the original verdict was overturned, and Daniel Thorne's conviction was vacated. After 2 long, lost years of quiet, sterile confinement, Daniel Thorne was, legally and factually, a free man. The resolution of Daniel's innocence was, however, not the ultimate end of the story. The truth carried a heavy responsibility. The true original thief was still at large. The initial police investigation, satisfied with Daniel's coerced guilt, had mistakenly filed away all other leads. The police force, now facing significant public scrutiny and internal review, was forced to renew the investigation from a new starting point. This time, they followed Clara's roadmap. They used the exact time-stamped library footage to narrowly refine the precise windows of the robberies, and they focused intensely on the physical descriptions and the vehicle records, the blue pickup truck, that had been discarded as irrelevant. This meticulous second look, now driven by an adherence to documented fact rather than investigative pressure, quickly led the renewed investigation to a different suspect, a retired delivery driver living several quiet towns away. This man, who owned the correct model getaway car and whose own quiet life also served as a useful mask, was quickly apprehended based on new, genuine evidence. The original case was truly closed, not by the initial loud coerced signature, but by the quiet, methodical re-examination of the overlooked details found in the back of the file. Daniel Thorne's quiet innocence was finally and conclusively established, and the integrity of the system, though painfully slow, was finally restored. The time for error was over. The time for verifiable fact had arrived. Daniel Thorne was finally free. The years of confinement, spent quietly enduring the harsh consequence of a truth he never spoke, were over. His quiet innocence had been conclusively confirmed. The appeal court's decision marked a profound yet silent victory for due process. It was a testament to the slow, deliberate triumph of documented fact over the hurried, loud expediency of the initial investigation. The signed confession, the single piece of evidence that had stolen 2 years of Daniel's life, was now nothing more than an invalidated footnote in a closed file. Daniel's release was as unassuming as his life. He returned not to a fanfare or a public declaration, but to his small, familiar apartment. His first action was not to seek revenge or spectacle, but to walk back into the local public library, quietly requesting his old position shelving books. His only desire was the simple, reliable return of his quiet, predictable life. He sought no fame, no public platform. His peace was found in the known rhythm of his routine. His story became a quiet, enduring lesson within the legal and investigative community, a subtle yet powerful reminder that a signed confession, however convenient or compelling, is never enough. Justice, the case showed, is not achieved by the loudest voice or the fastest signature, but is ultimately found in the patient, corroborating quietness of every single verifiable fact. The failure of the system was reversed by the methodical work of a single patient paralegal Clarissa Voss, whose dedication to the truth was as unwavering as Daniel's devotion to his books. The restoration of order. The quiet victory of the appeal and the subsequent capture of the true culprit, the retired delivery driver identified by the blue pickup truck, brought a final, deep sense of resolution to the town. The initial fear and the subsequent false sense of security were replaced by a genuine, quiet confidence in the eventual triumph of procedural integrity. The local police department, having faced significant internal review and external scrutiny, was forced to implement sweeping changes. Their training protocols were completely overhauled, focusing on the dangers of confession-driven tunnel vision and prioritizing the rigorous confirmation of alibis and physical evidence before any arrest. The flawed system was painfully, slowly repaired through the dedicated focus on methodical detail. The narrative of the robberies, once distorted by fear and haste, was finally replaced by the true account of the actual thief. The chaos that had upended Daniel's life and troubled the town was contained and filed away. The town returned to its calm rhythms, a small community made stronger and wiser by its painful encounter with procedural error. The sense of vulnerability was replaced by the deep, profound stillness of a resolved threat. This entire sequence, from the initial mistaken accusation to the quiet, methodical exoneration, offers a unique kind of comfort for the listener. It is the recognition that even when trust is betrayed and the system fails, there is an unseen, powerful counterforce of quiet logic and detailed procedural work that ultimately prevails. There are no loose ends. There is only finality and the restoration of balance. The emotional noise of the trial has faded, leaving only the calm certainty of fact. The story is a powerful testament to the healing power of routine and the triumph of the inner spirit. Daniel Thorne's quiet courage to endure the long, desolate 2 years, and Clarissa Voss's relentless dedication to the dusty file folders proved that persistence in the pursuit of truth will eventually restore order to the most profound injustices. This peaceful resolution is now fully integrated into the historical record, a closed chapter that asks nothing more of us than acceptance of the final truth. The final sleep cue, and that is where we leave the case of the unseen confession. The innocence is established, the truth is confirmed, and the painful memory of the crime is now confined to the past. The threat has been completely removed. The meticulous work of the investigation is finished, and the narrative has reached its conclusive, settled end. Allow yourself to feel the deep satisfaction of this final closure. Your mind no longer needs to solve the puzzle, anticipate the next step, or worry about the outcome. There are no more knots to untangle, no more secrets to uncover, only the gentle satisfaction of justice achieved and order restored. This quiet, slow conclusion is the purpose of this story. It is your cue to fully detach. Let the smooth, continuous sounds around you draw your mind toward the quietude of sleep. Feel the slow, even, predictable movement of your own breath. Inhale deeply, and slowly exhale. Let the distant, soft, revolving light be your final, peaceful guide, signaling the steady, safe presence of order throughout the night. It is a beacon of calm in the darkness. You are secure. You are warm. You are calm. Sleep now. We take our final journey tonight, moving away from the quiet mysteries of the archive and the finality of the courtroom. We enter, instead, the controlled, highly regulated world of international diplomacy and espionage. Our setting is a large, historic European embassy in the mid-1970s, a place where the greatest defense is not steel doors, but strict, unyielding protocol and absolute, total secrecy. Imagine the embassy grounds, high stone walls, meticulously manicured lawns, and the steady, quiet presence of uniformed guards. Inside, the heart of this complex world is the cipher room. This room is the nerve center where all classified communications are encoded, decrypted, and managed. It is a fortress within a fortress, protected by multiple physical layers, steel doors, reinforced walls, and a constant, low-level atmospheric pressure designed to detect unauthorized opening. The most trusted individual within this highly sensitive system was Mr. Peter Hayes, the Chief Communications Officer. Hayes was a man whose entire existence was a model of unparalleled discretion and relentless routine. He was built for this role. Every element of his life was controlled, predictable, and simple, reflecting the rigid security he maintained at work. He lived in a government-issued apartment, purchased the same few items from the same stores, and avoided all personal extravagance. His adherence to protocol was his chief virtue. It made him professionally invisible and entirely trustworthy. He lived his quiet life governed by the predictable series of codes and sequences he managed every day. Hayes arrived at the embassy at 8 a.m. precisely every morning. He would pass through 3 separate security checkpoints, each requiring a specific key card and a manual log entry. Once inside the main building, his immediate destination was the cipher room. There, he would perform a mandatory sequence of security checks, manually verifying the seals on the cabinets, confirming the battery levels of the encryption machines, and ensuring the door sensors were calibrated. This careful, methodical sequence took him exactly 12 minutes every single day. The most sensitive item under his care was the daily green binder. This was a massive, heavy volume containing the critical, top-secret communications and intelligence summaries received over the previous 24 hours. This binder was never, under any circumstances, to leave the cipher room. Its access was controlled by a complex dual lock system on a specialized safe. Opening the safe required both Hayes's personal, lengthy numerical code and a secondary digital verification process executed by the main security grid. The system was designed to resist any physical attack or sudden force. It was, however, not designed to withstand methodical observation and patient internal exploitation. Hayes began to commit his quiet crime not out of political ideology or sudden avarice, but out of a deep-seated, chronic financial pressure that he meticulously kept hidden from the rigid scrutiny of his superiors. A relative in a neighboring neutral country required continuous, specialized, and extremely expensive medical treatment, costs that far outstripped Hayes's modest government salary. He needed a reliable, substantial, and above all, untraceable source of funds. His access to the cipher room offered an almost irresistible, silent opportunity. Hayes realized that the dual lock system, designed for maximum security through layered complexity, also presented a subtle, exploitable window of opportunity. The mechanism required him to enter his code, followed by a long 60-second digital verification cycle before the safe door could be fully opened. During this critical minute, the security protocol required Hayes to stand motionless, his hand on the safe door, waiting for the system to process the secondary code and confirm his identity. Hayes used this quiet minute not to simply wait, but to work. He obtained a high-resolution, silent digital camera, a rare and expensive piece of technology, purchased using cash over a long period. He placed this camera discreetly inside the cipher room, built into the housing of an old logging device. Every morning, during his protocol check, he would initiate the verification cycle. Then, using the small 60-second window, he would quietly retrieve the green binder from the safe before it fully locked. While the system was digitally verifying his identity, Hayes was already working, carefully opening the binder, turning pages, and documenting the most critical intelligence summaries with the silent digital camera. The entire security protocol was designed to confirm Peter Hayes's presence, that the correct, trusted individual was physically standing there, ready to accept the safe's contents. The motion sensors were deliberately programmed to ignore small, contained movements during that 60-second verification cycle, to avoid annoying false alarms triggered by a shift in weight or a scratch of an arm. Hayes leveraged this engineered silence, carefully flipping pages and documenting the intelligence summaries without causing the slightest electronic ripple. This act of betrayal was repeated every day for 6 long, methodical months. The photographs were then transferred to tiny microfilm cartridges, and through a quiet chain of dead drops and anonymous transfers, delivered to a foreign intelligence contact who paid handsomely for the consistent, reliable stream of information. The crime was a model of silent continuity, a daily, routine betrayal hidden perfectly within an impeccable daily routine. The only thing that left the cipher room was the light captured by the camera and the information contained within that light. The alarm was eventually raised not by a loud security breach within the embassy walls, but by a subtle, unsettling, external anomaly. Counterintelligence analysts, located hundreds of miles away, noted a disturbing, consistent pattern. Every critical diplomatic decision made by the embassy was being countered with uncanny precision by the opposing power, suggesting a reliable, high-level leak of information directly from the heart of the embassy's protected communications. The source had to be inside the cipher room, and the focus inevitably settled with quiet dread on the most routine and thus most trusted man, Peter Hayes. The silence of the betrayal had been too perfect, and the effect was now deafening. The consistent, quiet betrayal enacted by Peter Hayes went unnoticed by the embassy's physical security, but the consequences of his actions were beginning to resonate globally. Counterintelligence analysts working hundreds of miles away in isolated, secure rooms noted a profoundly disturbing pattern. Every major diplomatic initiative, every critical decision made by the embassy was being countered with uncanny, absolute precision by the opposing power. This suggested a consistent, high-level leak, a stream of information flowing directly from the very heart of the embassy's protected communications. The source, they concluded, had to be inside the cipher room. This realization initiated a silent internal investigation led by an expert profiler, Agent Lena Petrova. Petrova was a master of human analysis, a specialist in finding the missing motivation in a life that otherwise appeared perfectly routine. Her task was unique, to solve a crime where nothing was physically missing, and the only evidence was the enemy's unnatural foresight. She dismissed the noise of loud, sudden guilt and focused entirely on the soundless, unwavering perfection of the routine. Agent Petrova's initial review focused entirely on Peter Hayes. He was the most constant presence in the cipher room. She reviewed every aspect of his existence, his personnel file, his performance reviews, and his financial history. Like the auditors before her, she confirmed he had no obvious vices, no sudden splurges, and no political affiliations that would suggest ideological betrayal. His spending was controlled, modest, and utterly unremarkable. Yet Petrova persisted, widening the scope to include records that were considered private and confidential. She finally found the quiet fracture that explained the deviation. She noted a series of consistent, significantly large cash payments made over the past 6 months to a specific, highly specialized clinic in a neutral country near the border. These were payments for expensive, highly specialized treatments for an unnamed relative, costs that far exceeded Hayes's modest government salary. This was the silent, profound motive, a desperate, hidden financial pressure that superseded his professional loyalty and his ethical code. He needed money for life-saving treatment, and his access to the nation's secrets was his only available collateral. The investigation moved to the cipher room itself. Petrova refused to dismantle or obviously tamper with the complex security system. That would immediately alert Hayes, causing him to cease his activity and destroy the evidence. Instead, she devised a subtle procedural disruption designed to test Hayes's psychological rigidity and exploit his reliance on the clock. The security technical team, working quietly during a weekend shutdown, upgraded the dual-lock safe's control panel. They did not change the numerical code, nor did they alter the motion sensors. They simply recalibrated the digital verification cycle, extending the time from the familiar, predictable 60 seconds to exactly 75 seconds. This small, quiet extension of time, a mere 15 seconds, was the entire focus of the trap. It was designed to push Hayes past the psychological threshold of his comfort zone, forcing him to act outside of the precise minute he had built his crime around. The next morning, the operation was in effect. Hayes arrived at 8 a.m., retrieved his coffee, and proceeded to the cipher room, entirely unaware of the subtle modification. He initiated the standard security check. He entered his personal code and started the digital verification cycle. As the clock on the wall passed the predictable 60-second mark, his body language, which was being minutely documented by hidden, low-light cameras installed by Petrova's team, began to shift. He had always initiated his quiet copying protocol, retrieving the camera and turning the pages of the green binder at the familiar 60-second mark, anticipating the final click of the safe's secondary lock a moment later. But on this morning, the safe remained stubbornly, quietly locked. Hayes was forced to wait the additional 15 seconds. His body language shifted perceptibly from calm, controlled patience to subtle, contained anxiety. His hands, which usually rested calmly on the safe door, began to twitch. His breathing, monitored by a directional microphone, became shallow. He was visibly and psychologically unmoored by the disruption to his expected timeline. The moment the lock finally clicked open at 75 seconds, his movements were no longer smooth and professional, but jerky and visibly hurried as he tried to catch up to his own internal clock. The test confirmed two critical elements: Hayes's clear involvement and, more importantly, his absolute reliance on the 60-second interval for the execution of his criminal opportunity. The small, quiet extension of time had broken the rhythm of his betrayal. The perfect routine, when slightly altered, had exposed the man who depended on its static nature. Agent Petrova now had the irrefutable psychological evidence she needed to proceed. The truth was not found in a confession, but in a subtle, quiet change to the clock. Agent Lena Petrova now held all the quiet evidence needed. She had the financial motive, confirmed by the records of the expensive overseas medical treatments. Crucially, she possessed the irrefutable behavioral proof, the recorded visual evidence of Peter Hayes's contained panic during the 15-second extension of the safe's verification cycle. She knew the method of the crime, the why of the betrayal, and the exact moment the perpetrator broke his own perfect protocol. The final phase of the operation was initiated. It required a calm psychological takedown designed to mirror the meticulous nature of the crime itself. Petrova refused to allow the confrontation to devolve into a loud, frantic interrogation. That would only allow Hayes to retreat into denial and obstruction. Her goal was to present the truth with such undeniable, objective clarity that the confession became the only logical, predictable conclusion for a man obsessed with order. Petrova arranged a meeting with Hayes, not in a harsh, brightly lit interrogation room, but in a small, quiet, windowless office, a space designed to feel like a neutral extension of his own orderly, sterile world. The table between them was bare, except for two specific items placed with deliberate precision. The first was a single, file-wrapped document containing the financial transactions related to the foreign clinic. The second item was even more devastating: a printed copy of Hayes's security protocol manual, opened to the exact page detailing the precise 60-second digital verification cycle required for accessing the green binder safe. Hayes walked into the room at the appointed time, immaculate and controlled as always. He sat down, his face a mask of professional, if weary, composure. Petrova offered no greeting and made no small talk. She simply began speaking in a calm, flat tone, presenting the facts of his life and his hidden needs. She calmly presented the evidence, not with accusations, but with the dry, technical facts of his financial deviation. The large, consistent, unexplained cash sources, and the payments to the specialized clinic for his relative. She spoke of his desperation, the hidden fear that had driven him to compromise his professional oath. Hayes listened, his body remaining still, but the faint, rapid tremor in his fingers resting on his knee was the only evidence of his internal struggle. He was a man fighting to keep his internal collapse from becoming external chaos. Then Petrova pointed to the security manual on the table. She directed Hayes's attention to the paragraph that detailed the 60-second procedure, the very heart of his daily professional routine. She then placed a time-stamped photograph on the table beside the manual, an image captured by the hidden camera during the previous morning's routine check. The photograph showed Hayes standing at the safe, his face taut with confusion and quiet strain, exactly at the 65-second mark of the verification cycle. Petrova did not need to speak about the crime. She simply pointed out the contradiction. "Mr. Hayes, your manual states 60 seconds, yet this photograph shows visible distress at the 65-second mark. Your actions suggest that you were operating on a schedule that relied on the absolute, total predictability of the 60-second interval. When that predictability was extended by just 15 seconds, your routine and your control failed." Hayes stared at the manual, then at the photograph. He understood instantly. The counterintelligence team hadn't caught him with a smoking gun. They had caught him with a disrupted timetable. They understood his methodology perfectly. His meticulous planning had been utterly exposed by a mere 15-second procedural change. The truth was not a matter of ideology. It was a matter of timing. Hayes slowly, inevitably, broke. He did not yell or plead. He simply began to speak in a low, controlled monotone, detailing the crime with the same precise technical language he used for his daily log entries. He described the purchase and installation of the high-resolution camera, the specific angle required to photograph the green binder during the silent 60-second window, the creation of the tiny microfilm cartridges, and the exact sequence of the dead drops used to exchange information for cash. The confession was not coerced. It was the inevitable result of overwhelming objective procedural proof. For Hayes, a man obsessed with order, the only possible response to the exposure of his perfect flaw was a complete, final accounting. He confessed to a betrayal of information, confirming that the documents were never physically missing. They were always photographed and returned before the safe fully opened. Hayes was immediately removed, and his confession allowed the counterintelligence team to quickly identify the foreign contacts who were receiving the stolen intelligence and neutralize the security breach. The focus now shifts entirely to the aftermath and the quiet lessons learned from this breach of trust. The orderly world had suffered an internal wound, but the meticulous work of the counterintelligence team had restored the integrity of the system piece by methodical piece. The chaos was filed away, and the finality of the process had begun. The quiet confrontation in the windowless room had exposed the financial motive driving Peter Hayes. Agent Lena Petrova now knew why the chief communications officer had risked everything: the desperate, silent need for money to fund his relatives' costly, necessary medical treatment abroad. This was a tragedy of necessity, not a crime of ideology. With the motive confirmed, Petrova could proceed to dismantle the entire, meticulously constructed method of the betrayal. The final phase of the counterintelligence operation was the most critical: obtaining Hayes's full, uncoerced confession to confirm the entire chain of intelligence transfer. Petrova understood that the key to unlocking the truth was to speak to Hayes in the only language he understood: protocol and absolute objective proof. She presented him with the final, quiet facts that made his continued denial an impossibility. She placed the photograph from the hidden camera on the table, the one taken during the deliberate 15-second verification cycle extension. The image documented Hayes's visible distress at the 65-second mark, proving his reliance on the clock was absolute. She paired this visual evidence with the printed page of the security protocol manual, the one detailing the strict 60-second rule. The juxtaposition was devastatingly simple. His body language during those 15 seconds of uncertainty was louder than any verbal denial. Hayes stared at the two items, the printed rule and the photographic proof of his failure to adhere to that rule. He realized that the counterintelligence team hadn't merely suspected him, they understood his entire methodology better than he did. His meticulous planning had been completely and fundamentally exposed by a small, quiet change to the expected timeline. His perfect flaw was now visible to the world. He began to speak, not in anger or fear, but with the same low, controlled monotone he used for his daily log entries. The confession became a technical accounting of the crime, a final settling of his professional books. He detailed the method, the careful purchase and installation of the high-resolution, silent digital camera, the specific angle required to photograph the green binder during the silent 60-second window, the creation of the tiny microfilm cartridges, and the exact sequence of the dead drops used to exchange information for the necessary cache. He confessed to a betrayal of information, confirming that the documents were never physically missing, they were always photographed and returned before the safe fully opened. Hayes was immediately and quietly removed from the embassy premises. His detailed confession was invaluable to the counterintelligence team. It allowed them to quickly and decisively identify the foreign intelligence contacts who were receiving the stolen information and neutralize the security breach before further damage could be done. The crisis, though profound, was now contained within the embassy walls. The restoration of protocol. The subsequent investigation into the cipher room, now that Hayes was gone, confirmed the quiet genius of his operation. Technicians found the cleverly concealed high-resolution camera, its digital memory containing hundreds of photographed pages of classified summaries. They found the minute compartment he used to store the microfilm cartridges before they were moved to the dead drop. The entire operation was a masterpiece of methodical, patient subversion of protocol. The key finding was that the green binder was always returned before the safe fully opened, so nothing was ever physically stolen or missing. The crime was a continuous, daily breach of trust, secured by his absolute adherence to the rules surrounding the flaw. The methodical work of Agent Petrova and her team had achieved its primary goal: the restoration of confidence in the embassy's security. The focus shifted immediately to the quiet installation of new countermeasures. The dual lock safe was replaced with a newer model featuring randomly timed verification cycles, ensuring that the element of predictable time could never be leveraged again. All remaining analog technology, including the old logging device that housed Hayes's hidden camera, was immediately replaced with digitally encrypted systems. The orderly world had suffered a deep internal wound, but the meticulous, quiet work of the counterintelligence team had achieved the integrity of the system, piece by methodical piece. The chaos was filed away, and the finality of the process had begun. The orderly procedures, which Hayes had relied upon to hide his crime, now served as the very foundation of his downfall and the subsequent restoration of the secure environment. The knowledge gained from this quiet betrayal was used to fortify the system against future breaches of trust. The internal crisis was over. The internal crisis at the embassy had reached its decisive end. Peter Hayes was removed, and his meticulous confession allowed the counterintelligence team to immediately address the vulnerability he had exploited. The final crucial phase of the operation was the restoration of absolute security and the burial of the incident. The embassy's security team, now operating with the clear roadmap provided by Hayes's confession, immediately undertook a complete overhaul of the cipher room protocols. The large, imposing safe was replaced with a newer model, featuring randomly generated, digitally varied verification cycles. The critical flaw, the predictable 60-second interval that Hayes had relied upon, was eliminated forever. The new system ensured that the element of predictable time could never be leveraged by a trusted internal operative again. All remaining analog technology, including the old logging device that had housed Hayes's hidden camera, was systematically replaced with digitally encrypted, monitored systems. The environment was made entirely hostile to any form of physical surveillance. The green binder remained in the vault, its pages intact, now a quiet, powerful symbol of the internal breach. Nothing was ever physically stolen or missing. The crime was a betrayal of information, not a physical theft of property. This fact allowed the embassy to contain the scandal internally, preventing the noisy public fallout that would have accompanied a physical theft. The orderly procedures which Hayes had relied upon to hide his crime now served as the very foundation of his downfall and the subsequent restoration of the secure environment. The knowledge gained from his quiet betrayal was used immediately and decisively to fortify the system against future breaches of trust. Hayes was sentenced for espionage and the gross violation of trust. His final fate was sealed by the very precise records he kept. The internal investigation, led by Agent Petrova, concluded that the motive was purely financial, driven by the desperate need for his relative's medical treatments, not ideological. This subtle distinction allowed the government to handle the matter with extreme discretion, minimizing the diplomatic damage. The quiet tragedy of the case was that a man of such professional virtue was driven to compromise by an overwhelming personal crisis. The orderly professional world failed to see the chaos consuming his private life. The embassy returned to its core mission. The complex procedural rhythm that defined the place was re-established, stronger and less reliant on the absolute trust of a single individual. The internal crisis was over. The records of the investigation were classified at the highest level, filed away into a secure sub-vault, never to be seen again. The quiet damage was contained, and the truth was locked away beneath new layers of protocol and code. The final end of the story brings us back to the core lesson of the entire collection. The pursuit of perfection and absolute routine can become both the perfect camouflage for a crime and the critical flaw that leads to its discovery. The lighthouse keeper, the internal auditor, and the communications officer all were masters of their prescribed daily routine, and all were undone when their perfect, predictable schedules were either broken or exploited. The chaotic human element was quietly resolved by the methodical, unhurried work of objective investigation. This methodical conclusion is the purpose of this final segment. It is your cue to fully detach. The threat of the breach is neutralized, the intelligence is secured, and the meticulous work is complete. The system, once flawed, is now sound. Your mind no longer needs to solve the puzzle, anticipate the next move, or worry about the outcome. Allow yourself to feel the deep satisfaction of this final closure. Let the gentle, consistent, and rhythmic sounds around you draw your mind toward the profound tranquility of sleep. Feel the slow, steady swing of the pendulum receding into the distance, signaling the predictable, safe presence of time and order throughout the night. The chaos is contained. The files are sealed. The embassy is secure. You are secure. You are calm. Sleep now. We take a quiet turn now, away from the intense complexities of espionage and the rigid, mathematical world of the cipher room. We enter instead a place of deep, almost spiritual fascination, the specialized world of antique cartography. Settle your mind now and imagine a large, hushed research library in the early 1990s, a space where the air is cool, the light is dim, and the true measure of fortune is found not in digital stocks, but in the age and proven authenticity of ink on ancient paper. Our story centers on the quiet betrayal of history through the forgery of historical maps. These documents detailed the early exploration of the New World, charting nascent trade routes and the first tentative ventures into the American wilderness. They were prized, singular possessions, housed in the climate-controlled vaults of private collectors and prestigious museums across the continent. The entire, small, elite community of historians and collectors relied implicitly on the absolute trust placed in the authenticity of these fragile, beautiful pieces of paper and ink. The guardian and most respected authority in this quiet world was Dr. Eleanor Vane, a soft-spoken, highly respected expert in paper chemistry and historical inks at a prestigious East Coast university. Dr. Vane was a woman whose entire existence was a model of precision and quiet dedication. Her personal life was as predictable and meticulous as the scientific work required to preserve and analyze documents centuries old. Her routine involved the quiet, solitary analysis of chemical traces, the precise measurement of atmospheric decay, and the absolute focus on objective truth. She possessed a simple, fundamental belief that paper, even centuries after its creation, always told the truth about its origins, provided one knew how to ask the right, quiet, technical questions. Dr. Vane arrived at her lab every morning at 7:15 a.m., beginning her work before the sounds of the university day intruded. She used specialized microscopes and ultraviolet light, tools that revealed the hidden, subtle world of the document, the microscopic imperfections of the paper pulp, the minute crystal structure of the iron in the ink, and the deliberate lines drawn by a cartographer long since past. Her work was a silent communion with history. The first signs of the crime were not loud alarms or broken locks, but the quiet introduction of an unsettling number of stunningly preserved, previously unseen maps into the auction market. These documents were hailed as major, transformative discoveries, supposedly charting early North American trade routes that had long been considered lost. They were visually perfect, startlingly beautiful, and immediately fetched immense sums from wealthy, eager private collectors. The sheer volume of these new discoveries alone was cause for quiet academic wonder. But one quiet afternoon, as Dr. Vane was granted access to study one of these recently acquired maps, she felt a subtle, almost imperceptible disharmony. The paper felt right, it was aged and brittle, carrying the correct historical weight. The image was geographically correct, detailing the routes expected of the late 17th century. Yet something in the texture of the ink, when viewed under a low-power lens, felt wrong. The lines were too sharp, too black, lacking the specific, gentle decay pattern of genuine iron gall ink. It was a feeling she could not ignore, the sense that the document was simply too perfect to be true. This initial unease grew into a quiet professional suspicion. Dr. Vane decided to initiate a systematic, microscopic, and chemical examination of the suspected map. She worked alone in her locked laboratory during the late, quiet hours of the night, taking extreme care to ensure that no one, not a student, not a colleague, interrupted her solitary pursuit of the scientific truth. She did not seek to prove fraud. Her mission was simply to prove the map's authenticity, believing her initial sense of disharmony must be an error. Her investigation focused initially on the chemical signature of the black ink. Genuine 17th century European cartographers relied entirely on iron gall ink, a compound painstakingly derived from natural sources, oak galls and iron sulfates. This ink darkens over time as the iron oxidizes, creating a predictable, centuries-long decay pattern. Dr. Vane took minute, almost invisible samples from the lines of the suspected forgery and compared them directly against the confirmed genuine maps in the university's reference collection. The results, when they finally appeared under the mass spectrometer, were subtly, profoundly chilling. The ink of the forged map contained minute, trace elements of synthetic titanium dioxide, a brilliant white pigment that was scientifically confirmed not to have been commercially available to any manufacturer until the late 1920s. The chemical signature was exceptionally faint, only a few molecules scattered within the ink mixture, but it was scientifically undeniable. The map's visual history dated it convincingly to 1680, but its chemical history dated it conclusively to the modern era. The brilliant, painstaking forger had successfully replicated the look of iron gall ink, but had inadvertently mixed in a tiny, modern brightening agent with the paper preparation or the ink base. The flaw was microscopic, silent but absolute. The methodical discovery confirmed the operation of a skilled, deeply patient counterfeit cartographer, a person undermining the absolute trust of the entire antique market. Dr. Vane, armed with her objective chemical proof that spoke louder than any human testimony, quietly contacted the local authorities, who quickly brought in the FBI's art crime team. The case was taken up by Agent Robert Keller, a quiet specialist who understood that chasing this kind of ghost required the meticulous patience of an academic and the chemical precision of a scientist. The theft was not one of violence, but one of insidious, silent forgery. Dr. Eleanor Vane's initial unease, that subtle, almost imperceptible feeling of disharmony when studying the new, supposedly ancient map, could not be ignored. Her expertise, honed over decades of quiet, focused analysis, told her that while the map's geography and parchment seemed correct, something in the very essence of the ink was wrong. She knew that in the world of history, absolute perfection often signals absolute deceit. She began the slow, methodical process of proving her quiet suspicion. This required a deep, systematic, microscopic examination of the map, a task she undertook alone in her locked, specialized laboratory during the late, quiet hours of the night. Her work was not a hurried search for evidence, but a patient, scientific pursuit of the document's true chemical biography. She sought not to prove fraud, but to prove the map's truth, whatever that truth might be. Dr. Vane's investigation focused intensely on the chemical signature of the black ink. Genuine 17th century European cartographers used iron gal ink, a compound painstakingly created from natural sources, a mixture of iron sulfates and tannic acid extracted from oak galls. The crucial characteristic of this ink is its centuries-long decay pattern. It begins dark and gradually darkens and corrodes the paper over time as the iron component oxidizes, leaving a predictable, subtle signature of age. The ink ages with the history it records. To verify her suspicion, Dr. Vane performed the necessary forensic sampling. She took minute, almost invisible samples from the lines of the suspected forgery and compared them directly against control samples taken from confirmed, genuine maps in the university's secure reference collection. This process required a delicate touch and absolute precision, ensuring the integrity of both the sample and the map itself remained intact. The samples were prepared and placed under the mass spectrometer, a highly specialized instrument designed to identify the exact chemical elements present in the minute material. The initial digital reading was consistent with iron gal ink, showing high traces of iron and tannic acid compounds. But as Dr. Vane refined the scan, focusing on the trace elements, the things that shouldn't be there, the results began to shift, revealing a chillingly subtle anomaly. The forged ink contained minute, trace elements of synthetic titanium dioxide. This element is a brilliant white pigment commonly used as an opacifier or a modern brightening agent in paints and papers. The scientific reality was stark and absolute. The chemical was confirmed by scientific consensus not to have been commercially available or industrially manufactured in any part of the world until the late 1920s. The chemical signature was exceptionally faint, a few molecules scattered and mixed within the primary iron component, but it was scientifically undeniable. The evidence was devastating in its simplicity. The map's visual history and its geographical details dated it convincingly to 1680, matching the claims of the seller. However, its chemical history dated it conclusively to the modern era, to the 20th century. The methodical discovery confirmed that a skilled, patient, and criminally informed individual, a counterfeit cartographer, was operating. This individual had been able to painstakingly replicate the visual look of centuries-old iron gal ink and the texture of aged paper, but had inadvertently mixed in a tiny, modern brightening agent with the ink base or the paper preparation. The flaw was microscopic, silent, and entirely overlooked by the creator, yet it was absolutely absolute. The entire antique map market was being silently undermined by this one person's operation. Dr. Vane, armed with her objective, chemical proof that spoke louder than any human testimony, made a quiet, necessary call to the authorities. The case was immediately taken up by the local police, who quickly escalated it to the FBI's art crime team. The investigation was assigned to Agent Robert Keller, a specialist who understood that chasing this quiet ghost required the unique patience of an academic and the chemical precision of a scientist. The crime was not one of violence, but one of insidious, slow, silent forgery, exposed by the most minute of scientific details. The focus now shifted entirely from the lab table to the meticulous tracking of the modern chemical trail. Dr. Eleanor Vane's meticulous work had yielded the crucial, quiet truth. The beautiful, supposedly historical map was a lie. The presence of synthetic titanium dioxide, a 20th century chemical, acted as the irrefutable signature of the forgery. This proved the operation was modern, sophisticated, and deeply rooted in chemical knowledge. The investigation now pivoted entirely from the silent laboratory to the complex, modern marketplace. The challenge was to find the counterfeit cartographer not through the map's history, but through its chemical geography. Agent Robert Keller of the FBI's art crime team and Dr. Vane formed an unconventional, quiet partnership. They knew the maps were fake, they knew the technique was flawless, but they needed to find the artist. Their search focused not on the subject matter of the map, but on the tools of the deception. They began to pursue the paper trail of the raw materials required to create the forgery. Dr. Vane provided the key forensic details that guided the search. She noted that the paper, although expertly aged, exhibited a specific unusual ratio of lead acetate, the chemical compound used by the forgerer to artificially induce the paper's brittle, yellowed, centuries-old appearance. She theorized that the forgerer was a single individual working in a consistent environment using a specific, easily traceable batch of this chemical. This unique aging process, applied to the high rag content paper, the base material of the forgery, served as a kind of silent fingerprint left on every piece of the fraudulent collection. The investigation quietly and methodically tracked the highly unusual sales of the essential, specialized components required for the elaborate fraud. These included specific, rare consignments of high rag content paper, blanks that had been manufactured decades ago and held in specialized paper warehouses. The team also tracked the purchase of rare European pigments necessary to replicate the subtle color shifts of centuries-old cartography. And most importantly, they quietly monitored the wholesale acquisition of the specific industrial-grade titanium dioxide that Dr. Vane had identified in the ink. The forger needed these materials to replicate history. The investigators need the records of these purchases to unmask the artist. The methodical, patient tracking of these quiet supply chains began to narrow the geographic search area. The purchases of the rare, specific chemicals and the unusual antique paper were traced to a handful of independent chemical supply houses and specialized art material vendors scattered across the eastern seaboard. Agent Keller assigned analysts to meticulously cross-reference the customer lists of these specialized vendors. They realized that their suspect would not be a typical customer. They would be someone who bought obscure, unrelated industrial chemicals like titanium dioxide, alongside highly specific archival paper and aging agents. This quiet work eventually led the investigators to a small, unassuming art restoration studio tucked away in a quiet corner of New England. The studio was owned by Miles Corbin. Corbin was known in the quiet, tight-knit community of antique restorers as being exceptionally skilled, meticulous, and intensely private, a man who preferred the solitude of his studio to any public interaction. The final damning financial link was established when Agent Keller's team reviewed the bank records of Corbin. They found a series of large, sequential cash purchases and deposits, transactions that perfectly matched the estimated revenue from the private sale of the forged maps. Corbin was selling the maps for large sums and then using the cash to purchase the very specific raw materials needed for his next quiet project. The chemical signature, the unique aging process, and the paper trail now pointed toward a single quiet studio where the forgeries were being meticulously crafted. The final piece of preparatory work involved an intense, quiet period of external surveillance on Corbin's studio. Agent Keller's team, determined not to alert the suspect, observed Corbin's routines. They confirmed that Corbin was a man of absolute habit, working late into the night, often alone, surrounded by his chemicals and his paper. His meticulous habits, like those of Peter Hayes and Wallace Flynn, were his camouflage. The chemical signature, the titanium dioxide that shouldn't have been there, and the established paper trail led the investigators to the point of final action. They were ready to move on the studio armed with the quiet, undeniable proof that the perfect, centuries-old map was in fact a very recent and very flawed creation. The final phase would be the quiet, controlled confrontation with the counterfeit cartographer himself, unmasking the artist behind the silent crime. The quiet, methodical investigation, led by Agent Keller and Dr. Vane, had culminated in an undeniable truth. The chemical signature of the maps, specifically the modern synthetic titanium dioxide, pointed directly to a single suspect. The paper trail, tracking the unique aging chemicals and the rare antique paper stock, confirmed the identity of that suspect as Miles Corbin, the quiet, highly respected art restorer from New England. The time for quiet, academic analysis was over. The time for decisive, controlled action had arrived. Agent Keller secured a federal warrant to search Corbin's secluded art restoration studio. The final phase of the operation was planned with the same meticulous calm that defined the crime itself. The goal was to enter the studio quietly, avoid damaging any potentially fragile evidence, and confront Corbin with the objective facts, forcing a confession based on the sheer overwhelming weight of scientific proof. The team, comprising Agent Keller, several forensic technicians, and Dr. Vane, who was essential for identifying the chemical tools, executed the warrant late on a Tuesday afternoon. This timing was chosen specifically because Corbin typically worked alone and remained in a focused, predictable state during this period. They entered the studio, and the atmosphere was immediately thick with the smell of old parchment, varnish, and chemical solvents, the very ingredients of historical preservation, now revealed as the tools of deception. The studio itself was a marvel of order. Every tool was precisely organized, every vial of pigment meticulously labeled. This level of tidiness was not the hallmark of an average criminal. It was the signature of a craftsman obsessed with control and exactitude. It mirrored the precise, clean lines of the forged maps. They found no obvious signs of wealth, no piles of cash, no extravagant display, only the specialized equipment of a man consumed by his secret, expensive craft. The team began the detailed, systematic search, guided by Dr. Vane's expertise. They found no trace of the stolen auction money, confirming that Corbin was careful to convert his earnings into untraceable assets immediately. They found no grand conspiracies, but they did find the evidence of process, the quiet residue of the forgery operation. On a long, well-lit workbench, technicians discovered a large, rectangular sheet of high-rag content paper, the same rare, expensive blank paper stock that Dr. Vane had identified in the forged maps. The edges of the paper were still clean, awaiting the delicate process of chemical aging. This was the proof of supply. On a separate, smaller table, protected under a layer of clean cloth, they found a small, polished copper printing plate. The plate was intricately etched with the reverse image of one of the recently discovered North American trade route maps. The copper etching plate, used to press the original image onto the chemically aged paper before the final hand coloring was applied. This was the final, devastating piece of technical evidence, proving that the supposed 17th century artifact had been manufactured right there in that quiet, orderly studio. When Miles Corbin was brought back into his studio and confronted with the evidence, the scene was one of contained, clinical confrontation. Agent Keller did not raise his voice. He simply pointed to the two items, the matching blank paper and the etched copper plate. Then he presented the simple, objective fact from the lab. the presence of the modern titanium dioxide in the ink used on the final maps. Corbin, a man whose life was dedicated to the unwavering truth of materials, recognized that he had been beaten by the very science he mastered. He realized his work, which he believed was perfect, had failed due to a flaw that was both invisible and absolute. His initial silence gave way not to fear, but to a strange, almost detached professional pride and resignation. He confessed. He detailed how he had created the maps not out of a sudden, impulsive need for quick cash, but as an intellectual challenge to his own skill. He believed his meticulous work was the ultimate combination of art and chemical science, creating a forgery that defied all existing historical authentication methods. His only regret was that his exposure was caused not by a historical or artistic flaw, but by a microscopic modern chemical signature he thought he had successfully neutralized. He had exploited the reverence for history for personal gain, and his perfect work was undone by the quiet, equally perfect work of the scientist. The entire crime was now laid bare. A patient, intellectual fraud, executed over years by a man who had leveraged his technical trust for a private, silent fortune. The chaos he introduced into the historical community was now contained within the orderly walls of his own studio. The process of justice, guided by objective fact, was completed with the same methodical quiet that defined the crime itself. The recovery of the forged maps marked the decisive and quiet end of the case. Miles Corbin, the counterfeit cartographer, was exposed, and his operation was completely shut down. The immediate aftermath focused intensely on damage control and the quiet process of restoration within the scholarly community that he had so deeply violated. The forged maps themselves were swiftly and quietly removed from the auction market and all private collections. They were not destroyed, but were instead cataloged by the FBI and Dr. Vane's team, not as historical artifacts, but as examples of criminal ingenuity, case studies in the evolution of modern art forgery. This established a new, silent database for future authentication efforts, a testament to the fact that even deception can be classified and studied. The integrity of the historical manuscript community was restored, fortified by a new, cautious skepticism and a deep reliance on modern chemical analysis. Corbin was prosecuted and faced sentencing for fraud and grand larceny. His technical brilliance, which made his crime possible, was ultimately irrelevant to the court. His quiet life in the studio was replaced by the sterile, absolute routine of a federal prison. His case served as a harsh, quiet reminder that the violation of professional trust carries a heavy penalty, even when the crime is non-violent. The man who sought to control history with chemistry was ultimately controlled by the law. The restoration of academic trust. Dr. Eleanor Vane was instrumental in establishing new protocols for authentication. She instituted a mandatory system where any historical document entering the university's possession, especially those dating before the 20th century, must now undergo a simple, quiet chemical check for modern brightening agents and synthetic pigments. This ensured that chemical proof would always precede market value, protecting history from future deception. Her work solidified the idea that the quiet objectivity of science must be the final guardian of the past. The university archives, which had quietly absorbed the shock of the breach, resumed their essential stillness. The focus returned to the quiet work of preservation, monitoring humidity, tracking temperature, and cataloging genuine history. The system was repaired, made stronger and less vulnerable to internal betrayal. The incident was contained, filed away in the records, a lesson learned and codified into a new, stricter set of procedures. The chaos of the forgery had been filed away, and the absolute order of the scientific method had prevailed, restoring the integrity of the scholarly world. The quiet, methodical work of the investigation, the tracking of the chemical traces, the monitoring of the paper supply, and the analysis of the lead acetate offers a final, deep sense of intellectual resolution. It confirms that the truth is always available, hidden within the details, waiting for the patient observer to reveal it. This quiet victory is the final emotional note of the story, allowing the listener to feel the deep stillness of a resolved threat. This entire sequence, from the initial quiet suspicion in the laboratory to the final controlled recovery of the tools, is now complete. The narrative threads have been meticulously resolved. The criminal is contained. The integrity of the historical record is restored. The pursuit of perfection, whether by the criminal or the investigator, has reached its conclusive end. The chaos he introduced into the historical community is now contained within the quiet walls of his own judicial file. The time for analyzing the crime is over. The time for rest has arrived. The final sleep cue. The purpose of this final sequence is to provide cognitive closure, to ensure that your mind has no lingering questions, no remaining threats, and no reason to remain vigilant. The stories of the lighthouse keeper, the internal auditor, the communications officer, and the counterfeit cartographer have all been fully told, their mysteries solved, and their chaos contained within the final sealed files of justice. Allow yourself to feel the deep satisfaction of this final closure. Your mind no longer needs to solve the puzzle, anticipate the next move, or worry about the outcome. There are no more knots to untangle, no more secrets to uncover, only the gentle certainty of the final truth. Let the smooth, consistent, and rhythmic sounds around you, the last fading whispers of the ambient noise, draw your mind toward the quietude of sleep. Focus only on the steady, predictable movement of your own breath. Inhale deeply and slowly exhale. Let the slow, rhythmic ticking of the clock be your final, peaceful guide, signaling the steady, predictable presence of time and order throughout the night. It is the sound of the world being safely regulated. The security system is armed. The files are sealed. The chaos is contained. You are secure. You are warm. You are calm. Sleep now.